Some men measure courage by the size of their enemy. Marcus Webb measured it by the size of his lie. The woman standing before him was nearly a foot taller, her shadow swallowing his in the afternoon sun like a predator, claiming territory. Behind her, 24 armed warriors watched with fingers tight on their weapons, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Behind him stretched nothing but empty desert and a half-broken ranch that barely kept him fed through the lean months. He knelt in the dust holding the hand of a woman whose name he'd heard only in trading conversations, telling the biggest lie of his life, with a conviction that surprised even him. The strange part was that she hadn't pulled away. Her fingers, rough and strong enough to snap his wrist without effort, remained perfectly still in his grip. Almost like she'd been waiting for anyone to do something this reckless. What Marcus didn't know in that moment was that his lie would force him to answer a question he'd been avoiding for 3 years, ever since the fever took Sarah and left him alone in a land that didn't forgive loneliness. The question was simple but brutal. What are you willing to lose for something real? The morning had started the way most did in the territories. Quiet in a way that pressed against the eardrums. Too quiet. Marcus's ranch sat in a pocket of land where the desert met grassland, close enough to Apache territory that most settlers wouldn't risk it. But Marcus had always kept his distance from other colonists. Their judgment, their questions about why he'd come west, their pitying looks when they asked about his wife. The Apache had come to tolerate his presence over 3 years because he traded fairly, never pushed boundaries, never caused the kind of trouble that brought soldiers. He was alone out here, and he told himself every morning when he woke to an empty house that he preferred it that way. The lie was starting to wear thin, even before today shattered it completely. He'd been mending fence posts when he heard them. Voices carried on the wind, too many to be a hunting party, too formal to be casual travel. Marcus straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, with a forearm that had darkened from months under the southwestern sun. He watched as a group crested the ridge to the east, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning sky. 2 groups, he realized as they drew closer. He recognized the nearer one. Warriors from the band that sometimes traded with him, faces he knew from brief exchanges of goods and careful respect. But the others, the ones riding behind with harder faces and weapons, held ready in a way that suggested expectation of use, those he didn't know. Something felt wrong. The way they moved carried formality and tension, like dignitaries arriving for negotiations that might end in bloodshed. Marcus should have gone back to his fence, should have minded his own survival the way he'd done for 3 years, keeping his head down and his grief private. But curiosity pulled harder than common sense. It always had. That was how he'd ended up out here in the first place, following Sarah west, when every reasonable person told them to stay in Ohio, where life was predictable and safe. He kept low-moving through brush and rock until he could see the gathering below in a natural basin where 2 ridges met. The positioning was deliberate, he realized. Whoever had called this meeting had chosen ground where voices would carry, but where no one could approach unseen. Smart, defensive. That made him more uneasy. That was when he saw her. The woman stood a full head taller than any warrior present, and these were men chosen for strength and skill. Her frame wasn't just tall, but powerful in a way that made everyone around her seem smaller by proximity. She wore traditional Apache clothing, leather, and woven fabric marked with patterns Marcus had learned to recognize through years of trading. But the way she carried herself spoke of someone who'd earned respect through more than heritage or gender. Her arms were crossed, jaw set, and even from 70 yards away, Marcus could read the anger in every line of her posture. This was a woman who'd been pushed to a boundary she had no intention of crossing. An older warrior was speaking, his tone carrying the weight of authority earned over decades. Marcus's Apache was rough, learned through trade and observation rather than formal teaching. He caught fragments: marriage, alliance, duty to the people, strength of the bond between tribes, the usual political language that wrapped individual lives in obligations they never chose. The woman's response was sharp enough to make several warriors flinch. She refused. Flat, absolute refusal that left no room for negotiation. That was when the other man stepped forward. He was taller than the others, built like violence waiting for permission. A scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, the kind that came from surviving something that should have killed. When he smiled, it was the expression of a predator that had already won. Neshoba Marcus heard someone call him. The name meant wolf, and it fit. Even without understanding every word, Marcus knew a threat when he witnessed one. The way the man moved closer to her, invading the space most would respect. The way his hand rested on his weapon, casual but deliberate. The way the warriors behind him shifted in unified menace, like a pack responding to their leader's mood. She was being given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Marry this man, strengthen the alliance between their peoples, accept her duty, or there would be consequences. For her people, for everyone who depended on the fragile peace between tribes that occupied overlapping territories. Marcus watched her hands curl into fists, watched her stand her ground even as the circle tightened around her, watched her face show nothing but contempt for the man trying to claim her through political pressure rather than genuine connection. He recognized something in her stance that hit him square in the chest with unexpected force. She was alone, surrounded by people forced into an impossible situation and completely alone in the way that mattered. The way he'd been alone since Sarah died, surrounded by a ranch full of chores and memories, but fundamentally isolated from anything that felt like living rather than just surviving. His feet were moving before his brain caught up with what he was doing. Down the ridge across open ground that left him exposed to every weapon and suspicious gaze. Straight into a situation that could end him in about 15 different ways. Warriors turned voices, shouting an alarm. Weapons raised, bows drawn, rifles lifted. But Marcus kept walking, hands visible and away from his sides until he stood at the edge of the circle that had formed around the woman. They all stared at him. The woman's eyes met his, dark and questioning, trying to understand what kind of fool walks into an armed standoff with nothing but audacity. Marcus swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, heart hammering against his ribs hard enough that he wondered if they could see it through his worn shirt. But he'd started this walk and there was only one direction left to go. Forward. He looked at the older warrior who'd been speaking then at Neshoba with his predator's smile, then back to the woman who towered over him by almost a foot. Before he could talk himself out of it, before sanity could reclaim him and remind him that he was a nobody settler with no right to involve himself in Apache politics, Marcus dropped to one knee in the dust and reached for her hand. The moment his fingers touched hers, the shouting intensified. Multiple voices, angry and confused, demanding explanations. But Marcus raised his voice over the chaos, speaking in broken but determined Apache, supplemented with hand signs, when words failed him. She was already promised to him. They'd made an agreement trading interaction by trading interaction building toward this moment over seasons of careful approach. It was done. She was his intended, and any other claim came too late. Every word was a lie. But Marcus had never meant anything more in his life. The silence that followed felt loud enough to shatter stone. The woman Ayana he'd heard her called in trading talks stared down at the man kneeling before her. This stranger with sun-darkened skin and worn clothing who just walked into the center of an armed confrontation and claimed her as his own with words that could get him killed if she exposed them as false. His hand trembled slightly where it held hers, but his eyes stayed locked on hers with an intensity that asked a silent question. She could destroy him right now. One word, one denial, and this foolish lie would collapse. Neshoba would have his justification for violence, and this settler would be dead before sunset. But something stopped her tongue. Maybe it was the desperation she recognized in his face, the kind that came from having nothing left to lose. Maybe it was the way Neshoba's expression had shifted from triumph to rage, in the span of a heartbeat, his certainty cracking. Or maybe somewhere deeper than rational thought, it was the realization that this stranger had just offered her the only escape she hadn't considered. A way out that didn't require her people to bleed for her freedom. The older warrior Takota stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion and suspicion. He spoke directly to Ayana, his words sharp with the authority of someone who'd guided this band through decades of negotiation and survival. When had this happened? Why had she said nothing? Why had no one witnessed this arrangement between a warrior of their people and a settler who lived on the margins? Ayana felt every eye on her. The warriors from her own band looked betrayed, as if her silence had insulted their right to know her business. Neshoba's men gripped their weapons tighter, waiting for their leader's signal to respond to this insult with appropriate violence. And this man, this reckless stranger still on his knee, waited for her to either save or destroy him. She made her choice. Her fingers closed around his hand, firm and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried across the desert floor with the absolute certainty of someone who'd made countless life-and-death decisions on battlefields and hunting grounds. They had traded many times over the passing seasons. Words had been exchanged, intentions made clear in the careful way that people from different worlds approach connection. She had given her word in those private moments, and her word was not something she broke for political convenience or tribal pressure. The lie tasted strange on her tongue, but it came out smooth as truth. Neshoba exploded. He surged forward, his scarred face twisted with fury that made several warriors step back reflexively. His hand reached for the blade at his belt, the kind of move that could start a war if blood was spilled here. But Dakota moved between them, his authority still holding weight even as everything threatened to descend into chaos. The older warrior's voice cut through the tension with measured calm that had probably prevented violence more times than anyone could count. This changed everything, Dakota said. If there was a prior claim and arrangement made before Neshoba's tribe had traveled days to propose this alliance, it had to be honored. To break such an agreement would bring dishonor on everyone involved. The political ramifications would be worse than the broken alliance. They'd have to take this to the council, let the elders weigh the claims, and determine truth from deception. The stranger Marcus, she realized, having heard his name in trading talks but never spoken to him directly, rose slowly to his feet. Even standing, he barely reached her shoulder. But he didn't shrink from Neshoba's rage, didn't step back when the larger warrior closed the distance between them with the kind of aggressive posturing that usually made men back down or fight. Marcus stood his ground, and something in that stillness spoke louder than any threat. Neshoba spoke in rapid, harsh tones that carried threat in every syllable. His tribe had traveled for days. The alliance had been promised through proper channels. This settler had no right, no claim, no honor. He spat the last word like poison, like honor was a weapon he could wield to cut Marcus down without drawing a blade. Marcus responded in broken but determined Apache, supplementing with hand signs when words failed him. He meant no disrespect to Neshoba's tribe or their journey, but what had been agreed between him and Ayana came first. If Neshoba wished to challenge that claim, Marcus would accept whatever test was required to prove his commitment was genuine. His voice didn't waver, even though Ayana could see the fear flickering behind his eyes. The silence that followed felt like a held breath across the entire gathering. Ayana's mind raced. This man had no idea what he'd just offered. In her culture, such challenges were settled through combat endurance tests or trials that could easily result in severe injury or worse. He was smaller, clearly not a warrior by training or build, and would stand no chance against Neshoba in any physical contest. The wolf would tear him apart just to make a point about settlers knowing their place. But before Neshoba could accept the offer and seal Marcus's fate, Dakota raised his hand. There would be no challenge today, not here in the open, where blood spilled in anger could fracture the careful peace their peoples maintained. This situation required the council's wisdom, not immediate violence in the dust. Both parties would present their cases before the elders at sunset tomorrow. Until then, Marcus would remain as Ayana's guest under her protection. To harm him would be to harm her directly, and that would bring consequences no one wanted. It was clever, Ayana realized. Dakota was buying time, preventing immediate violence while forcing everyone to think through the implications. But it also meant she and Marcus would have to maintain this lie under intense scrutiny for more than a day. They'd have to provide proof of an arrangement that didn't exist, convince elders who'd spent decades reading people and detecting deception, and do it all while Neshoba looked for any crack in their story that would justify taking what he believed was his. Neshoba's hand lingered on his blade, fury radiating from every muscle, but he couldn't defy Dakota's authority without fracturing the already fragile alliance between their peoples. That would make him look like a man who valued his pride over his tribe's welfare. He nodded once, sharp and hostile, then turned and strode away. His warriors followed like a storm cloud moving across the landscape, their departure not an ending, but a promise of return. The tension broke slightly but didn't disappear. Ayana's own people stared at her with questions in their eyes. Questions she couldn't answer without exposing the truth and undoing whatever protection this lie provided. Marcus finally released her hand, and she felt the absence immediately. His skin was rough with calluses from ranch work. Warm despite the morning cool, and the loss of that contact felt more significant than it should have. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw real fear crack through his determined facade. His eyes asked the question his mouth couldn't form in front of witnesses. What had they just done? Dakota approached them both, his voice low and measured in a way that suggested private counsel rather than public judgment. At sunset tomorrow, they would need to provide proof of their arrangement, witnesses who'd seen them together, gifts exchanged as tokens of commitment, some evidence that this agreement existed before today, before Neshoba's arrival made such a claim convenient. Without it, the council would see through the deception, and Neshoba would have his justification for violence, not just against Marcus, but against Ayana, for the dishonor of lying to her elders. Ayana and Marcus exchanged a glance. They had nothing. No witnesses, no gifts, no shared history, just a lie told in desperation in approximately 30 hours to make it believable enough to survive. They walked in silence toward Marcus's ranch, the midday sun beating down with the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer. Ayana's people had dispersed to prepare for tomorrow's council, leaving her alone with this stranger who'd tied both their fates together with a single reckless lie. She could feel his nervous energy radiating beside her, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, probably aware that any warriors watching from distance would interpret their body language looking for signs of genuine connection or staged performance. When they crested the ridge and his property came into view, Ayana understood immediately why he lived alone out here. The ranch wasn't just small, it was barely surviving. A single structure with patched walls that had clearly been repaired multiple times with whatever materials were available. A corral with posts that leaned at odd angles, held upright more by habit than structural integrity. Land that looked like it fought him for every blade of grub, every head of cattle, every season of existence. This wasn't a man building a future. This was a man holding on to the past by his fingernails, unwilling or unable to let go and move forward. Marcus cleared his throat, the first sound either had made since leaving the gathering. His voice came out rougher than before, stripped of the false confidence he'd shown the warriors. The words arrived in English first, then he struggled to translate them to Apache, clearly more comfortable in his native language when not performing for an audience. He should explain, he said. Should tell her why he'd done what he'd done, why he'd walked into a situation that wasn't his business and made it his problem. Ayana stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the open desert, their height difference was even more pronounced. She crossed her arms, waiting with the patience of someone trained to read terrain and enemy movements before making decisions. Marcus struggled with the Apache words, switching back to English. When they failed him, hoping she understood enough, she did. Years of trading had given her more understanding of the settler tongue than most of her people cared to admit. He hadn't planned this, he said. He'd been fixing fence posts, mind, on the dozen other tasks that kept his ranch from falling apart completely. He'd heard voices carried on the wind and came to investigate nothing more than curiosity and maybe boredom, and he'd seen something that made him unable to walk away. He paused, searching for words in either language that could explain an impulse he didn't fully understand himself. He'd seen someone being forced into something they didn't want. He'd recognized it, that feeling of being trapped by other people's choices, of having your life decided by forces beyond your control. He knew what that felt like, and he couldn't just watch it happen to someone else. Ayana's eyes narrowed. Her voice came out flat, skeptical, in the way of someone who'd learned that noble intentions often masked selfish motivations. He'd risked his life for a feeling, for some abstract sense of justice or fairness that meant nothing in the practical reality of survival and politics. Marcus met her gaze without flinching. He'd risked his life because it was the right thing to do, simple as that. Some things didn't require complicated justification or strategic benefit. Some things were just right or wrong, and walking away would have been wrong. Ayana almost laughed. The sound died in her throat before it emerged. The right thing, as if honor and righteousness could stop Neshoba's blade or prevent a war between peoples over a broken alliance. But something in Marcus's face made her swallow the mockery. He believed it. This fool genuinely believed in doing right, even when it cost him everything. She'd known warriors who died for less noble reasons. They had no proof, she said, flatly switching to English to make certain he understood every word. No witnesses saw them trade with any romantic intention. No gifts were exchanged that signaled commitment rather than simple commerce. Nothing to show the council tomorrow that would make them believe his lie was actually truth told quietly. Our lie, Marcus corrected quietly. She'd backed it. She could have exposed him immediately, let Dakota's warriors remove him, and returned to facing Neshoba alone. But she hadn't. He was right. She'd made her choice in that moment, grasping onto this impossible escape like a drowning person reaching for driftwood. Some instinct, some desperate hope had made her support a lie from a stranger rather than accept a forced marriage to a man whose eyes promised possession rather than partnership. Maybe that instinct would get them both killed. Maybe it had been foolish. But she'd made her choice, and Ayana never second-guessed decisions made in the moment when second-guessing could mean death. Marcus walked to his small home and pushed open the door. The interior was sparse but clean, organized with the careful efficiency of someone who lived alone and couldn't afford chaos. A single bed, neatly made. A table with two chairs that looked like he'd built them himself from scrap wood. Shelves with supplies carefully arranged. Everything in its place, everything serving a function. But what caught Ayana's attention was the corner where a woman's belongings still sat untouched and preserved like a shrine. A brush with long hair still tangled in its bristles, auburn strands catching the light that filtered through the window. A shawl folded precisely the kind of care that spoke of hands that couldn't bring themselves to disturb the memory. A pair of worn boots that would fit someone much smaller than Marcus, positioned as if their owner had just stepped out of them and would return any moment to put them back on. Marcus saw where her gaze had landed, his jaw tightened, muscles working as he fought for control over emotions that clearly still ran raw. His wife, he said. The word came out rough. 3 years ago, fever took her in less than a week. He'd been helpless to stop it, helpless to do anything but watch her slip away, despite every prayer and every desperate attempt to cool her burning skin. The words were simple, but the pain underneath them ran deeper than any river Ayana had crossed. She understood then why he'd intervened today, why he lived alone out here, isolated from both his own people and hers, why he'd recognized something in her situation that moved him to action despite the obvious danger. He knew what it meant to lose choice, to have fate tear away everything and leave you standing in the ruins of a life you'd planned. He knew what it meant to be alone, even when you were surrounded by the trappings of existence. Ayana moved closer, examining the belongings with the respect one showed sacred objects. She didn't touch them, sensing that would be violation Marcus wasn't ready for. He kept her things, she observed. Not a question, just acknowledgement of what was obvious. Marcus nodded. He didn't know how to let go. Letting go felt like admitting Sarah had never existed, like their years together meant nothing if he couldn't hold on to these physical remnants. It was irrational, and he knew it. But knowing something and feeling it were different territories entirely. Ayana turned back to face him. For the first time since this began, she saw him not as a foolish settler or a convenient escape, but as a man carrying weight that matched her own. Different specifics, different losses, but the same fundamental burden of trying to figure out how to keep living when the life you'd planned was gone. They needed to create a history that didn't exist, she said. Her mind was already working through possibilities, the same strategic thinking she applied to hunting or battle, trading interactions that led to understanding, conversations that built connection over time, moments that would make their arrangement seem natural rather than convenient. They had to construct a believable timeline, complete with details specific enough to sound authentic but vague enough that no one could definitively disprove them. Marcus nodded slowly, exhaustion already visible in his shoulders. They had until sunset tomorrow. That was maybe 30 hours accounting for sleep they probably wouldn't get. 30 hours to build a relationship that would convince elders who'd spent decades reading people and detecting deception. Then they should start now, Ayana said. She needed to know about his wife, Sarah's name, how they'd met, what he'd loved about her, how she'd died. She needed to understand who Marcus had been before he became this isolated man living on the edge of civilization. Because if they were going to convince her people that he was capable of making a genuine commitment to someone from a different world, she needed to understand the man who'd done it before. Marcus looked confused and maybe a little defensive. Why did Sarah matter? She was dead and this lie was about the living. What did his past have to do with selling a false present? Ayana's expression softened slightly. Because people didn't change fundamentally. If Marcus was the kind of man who'd loved deeply enough to preserve his wife's belongings like sacred relics 3 years after her death, then he was the kind of man capable of the commitment their lie required. That consistency would show in how he talked about both relationships. If he couldn't speak authentically about Sarah, he'd never convince the council about Ayana. Marcus sat heavily in one of the chairs he'd built, exhaustion suddenly visible in every line of his body. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years of silence finally breaking. Her name was Sarah Miller before she became Sarah Webb. They'd met at a trading post in eastern Ohio where Marcus had been selling cattle from his family's ranch. Sarah was traveling with her father, a merchant who traded goods across the territories. She'd been carrying a sack of flour that split open, covering his boots in white powder. She'd apologized for 10 minutes straight, mortified beyond reason, while Marcus had laughed and told her it was fine. That was Sarah, he said. She worried about everyone, cared about everyone, sometimes to her own detriment. She'd argue with men twice her age about fairness and dignity for people they'd dismiss as beneath notice. Her father had alternated between pride and exasperation at his daughter's stubborn sense of justice. She was the one who'd wanted to come west, wanted to see what was beyond the settled territories, wanted to build something that was theirs rather than just inheriting his family's ranch and living the life that was expected. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he talked. They'd married within 6 months of meeting over her father's objections that they were rushing, that Marcus was taking his daughter into danger for no good reason. They'd bought this land with their combined savings and the small inheritance Sarah had received when her mother died. Built this house with their own hands, planted crops that mostly failed, raised cattle that struggled in the harsh climate. But they'd been happy, stupidly happy in a way that felt invincible, until the fever came. It had started like nothing, Sarah complaining of being tired of aches that she attributed to hard work. By the second day, she couldn't get out of bed. By the fourth day, she was delirious, burning up, despite every attempt to cool her down. Marcus had ridden for help, found a doctor 2 days away who'd come but arrived too late. Sarah had died in their bed in this house, surrounded by everything they'd built together. And Marcus had been left alone with grief and guilt and the question of why he'd survived when she hadn't. He'd kept her things because moving them felt like erasing her. He'd stayed on this failing ranch because leaving felt like abandoning their dream. He'd isolated himself because facing other people meant facing their pity or their judgment, and he couldn't bear either. For 3 years, he'd been surviving but not living, going through motions but feeling nothing except the absence of what had been. Until today, when he'd seen Ayanna facing forced marriage and recognized something that made him feel again. Made him act instead of just enduring. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it would get him killed. But at least he'd felt something other than numb grief. Ayanna listened without interrupting, her dark eyes studying him in a way that made Marcus feel exposed but not judged. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and moved to the window, her impressive frame filling the space backlit by afternoon sun that painted her in shades of gold and shadow. When she was younger, she said she'd always been the tallest girl, then the tallest among the boys. By the time she reached womanhood, she stood taller than their greatest warriors. Her people valued strength, respected it, honored it in battle and in leadership. But they also valued tradition, and tradition said women of her size made men uncomfortable. A woman who could best most warriors in combat, who could hunt better than the men tasked with providing for the tribe, who could track and fight and lead, was valuable. But that same strength that made her essential in battle made her unsuitable for marriage in most eyes. No man wanted a wife who towered over him, she said. No man wanted to sleep beside a woman who could snap his neck if she chose. They respected her as a warrior, but couldn't see her as a woman. She'd proven herself in countless hunts and conflicts, earned her place among the warriors through skill and courage rather than gender. But that very achievement had isolated her from the life most women in her tribe lived. She didn't fit with the women who wove and cooked and raised children. She didn't fit with the men who hunted and fought, but expected certain deference she couldn't give. She existed in between, valuable but alone. When Neshoba had approached the elders seeking a marriage alliance, they'd seen an opportunity. A warrior from another tribe wouldn't be diminished by her height or strength. The alliance would bring benefits to both peoples. It made political sense. But no one had asked Ayanna what she wanted. No one had considered that she might prefer loneliness to possession, that she might value her freedom more than political convenience. Marcus watched her profile, seeing the tension in her shoulders. Their loss, he said before he could stop himself. Any man who couldn't see past her height to the person beneath was a fool who didn't deserve her. Ayanna turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her features. She'd expected judgment or discomfort, the usual reactions from men confronted with a woman who challenged their assumptions about gender and power. Instead, Marcus looked at her with something closer to admiration, as if her height and strength were assets rather than obstacles. They returned to practical matters, the brief moment of connection set aside in favor of survival. They needed their story to be specific, Ayana said. Details that couldn't be easily disproven, but that would sound authentic to the elders who'd question them. When had they first traded? What had they exchanged? When had commercial interactions shift towards something more personal? Marcus thought back through 3 years of occasional trading. About 2 years ago, he said, early autumn, she'd come with 3 other warriors. They traded dried venison for coffee and sugar goods her people valued but couldn't easily obtain. He'd noticed her then because she was hard to miss, but he'd been too deep in grief to notice her as anything except someone tall. Ayana's eyes widened slightly. He remembered that the specific season and trade goods from 2 years ago. Marcus shrugged. Details stuck with him. It was a curse of his mind, remembering things that didn't matter while forgetting things that did. But yes, he remembered. She'd negotiated the trade with sharp efficiency while the other warriors had seemed content to let her handle the interaction. That had struck him as unusual, a woman conducting business while men watched. That worked, Ayana said. They could build from that first meeting. Say the conversations grew over time during subsequent trades. Say she'd taught him better Apache while he'd taught her more English. That understanding had built between them through these interactions slowly and carefully, the way people from different worlds had to approach connection. When did this understanding become an arrangement, Marcus asked. They needed to pick a specific moment that would feel authentic, significant enough to remember clearly, but private enough that no witnesses could contradict them. Last spring, Ayana decided. She'd come alone that time, Marcus confirmed. He did remember that because it had struck him as unusual. A warrior of her standing traveling without escort suggested either supreme confidence or deliberate isolation. It had been raining, he added. One of the few spring storms that brought actual precipitation instead of just dust and wind. They could use that, Ayana said. The rain had delayed her return, giving them time to talk longer than usual. Conversations that went beyond trading, touching on personal matters. Loneliness. Not fitting into the spaces their worlds created for people who didn't conform. He'd asked if she'd ever considered a different path. She'd been skeptical, suspicious of a settler's intentions the way her people had learned to be suspicious of all outsiders. But he'd offered something different. Not ownership, but partnership. Not possession, but respect. They'd agreed to consider it, to meet during subsequent trades to see if the idea had merit. They'd kept it quiet because they knew both their peoples would resist. Marcus stood warming to the fabrication as it took shape. They'd spent months building trust through careful conversation. She'd shared stories of her childhood, of the isolation that came with being different. He talked about Sarah, about the grief that had paralyzed him. They'd found common ground in their loneliness, in being surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. By late summer, they'd reached an understanding, a private commitment that they'd formalize when the time was right. The story felt true even as they constructed it from nothing. Marcus found himself almost believing they'd had these conversations, these connections. The emotions underlying the fabrication were real enough, even if the specific events were invented. They spent the next 2 hours refining details, creating a history from whole cloth. Trading sessions that never happened but could have. Conversations that felt authentic because they were built from genuine feelings. Moments of connection that existed only in the story they were building, but that carried emotional weight because both of them understood loneliness intimately. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening, Ayana noticed something that made her body tense. Marcus caught the shift in her posture, the way her eyes focused on the distant ridge to the north. Someone had been watching earlier, she said quietly, from that ridge. They'd been careless, silhouetted against the skyline, in a way that suggested either arrogance or deliberate message. Either way, it meant their preparation was being observed and reported. Neshoba's man Marcus said, his stomach dropped with the realization of what that meant. The spy had seen them enter the house, seen them talking for hours, seen them building this story rather than having evidence ready. If that was reported to Neshoba, he'd know they were fabricating proof instead of presenting genuine history. He'd bring that knowledge to the council, use it to dismantle their lie piece by piece. The foundation they'd carefully constructed suddenly felt fragile as sun-dried clay. One wrong question at tomorrow's council meeting. One detail they couldn't corroborate, one inconsistency in their timeline, and the entire deception would crumble. Worse, they'd face consequences not just for the lie, but for the dishonor of attempting to deceive the elders. Ayanna would lose standing among her people. Marcus would probably lose his life. They needed physical proof, Ayanna said. Her warrior instincts were taking over, assessing the tactical situation with the same focus she'd apply to planning an ambush. Something tangible they could present to the council. Gifts were traditional and Apache courtship items exchanged to show commitment and respect. If they claimed months of building relationship, there should be evidence of that. Something he'd given her, or she'd given him, that demonstrated genuine connection rather than convenient fabrication. Marcus turned to look at Sarah's belongings in the corner. The shawl, the brush, the boots, physical remnants of a life that had ended 3 years ago, but that he'd preserved like sacred relics. He'd kept these things because letting them go felt impossible, like admitting Sarah had never mattered, like their years together could be erased by time and circumstance. But now he was looking at them differently. Not as memories to preserve, but as tools for survival. His survival and Ayanna's both. Sarah would have helped, he realized. She'd always stood up for people being forced into situations they didn't choose. It had driven her father to distraction the way she'd argue with authority figures about fairness and dignity. She would have walked right into that circle of warriors the same way Marcus had driven, by the same stubborn sense of justice. Ayanna saw where his gaze had landed. She moved closer, understanding without words what he was considering and what it would cost him. She didn't touch the belongings, respecting their significance. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. He didn't have to do this. She could refuse Neshoba directly. Fight him if necessary, challenge him to single combat, and prove through strength that she wouldn't be claimed through political pressure. Marcus didn't have to sacrifice his wife's memory for a stranger he'd known for less than a day. Marcus shook his head. The clarity of his decision surprised him, cutting through the fog of grief he'd carried for 3 years. Sarah would understand. She'd want him to help, want him to do the right thing, even when it cost him something precious. Holding on to ghosts didn't honor the dead, he realized. Living did, making choices that mattered, taking risks that meant something, feeling again, instead of just enduring. That was how he could honor Sarah's memory, not by preserving her belongings like a shrine, but by living the kind of life she'd valued. He picked up the shawl, feeling its weight in his hands. The fabric was simple but well-made, woven with care. Sarah had bought it from an Apache woman at a trading post, attracted by the craftsmanship in the pattern. She'd worn it constantly in the cooler months, and it still carried the faintest trace of her scent. Or maybe that was just memory playing tricks, assigning sensation to objects because the mind needed something concrete to hold. This could work, he said. They could claim Ayanna had woven it herself and given it to him during their spring meeting. A significant gift, personal and meaningful, showing her willingness to bridge their two worlds. The fact that it was genuine Apache weaving would help. The elders would recognize authentic work. Ayanna examined the shawl carefully. The pattern was traditional, but with subtle variations that suggested an individual weaver's style. It would pass inspection as something she might have made, though she'd have to claim credit for work that wasn't hers. That felt like dishonor, but smaller dishonor than lying about an entire relationship. She could live with taking credit for anonymous craftsmanship if it meant avoiding forced marriage. They spent the evening refining their story around the shawl. Ayanna had given it to Marcus last spring during that rainy meeting. It represented her trust, her willingness to share something personal. In Apache culture, weaving was intimate work, and giving woven goods showed care and commitment. Marcus had kept it close, valued. It carried it with him as a reminder of their growing connection. The story felt authentic because the emotions underlying it were real, even if the specific events were fabricated. As full darkness fell and exhaustion finally caught up with both of them, Marcus offered Ayanna his bed while he'd sleep on the floor. She refused, saying she'd sleep outside under the stars the way she was accustomed. That would look better anyway if anyone was watching. A warrior wouldn't sleep inside a settler's house, wouldn't show that level of intimacy before marriage was formalized. They had to be careful about appearances, about what observers would find credible versus what would raise suspicions. Marcus didn't argue. He was too tired for debate, and she was probably right about the optics. He lay down on his bed fully clothed, expecting sleep to elude him the way it had most nights since Sarah died. His mind should be racing with anxiety about tomorrow's council meeting, about all the ways their lie could unravel, about the consequences of failure. Instead, he found himself thinking about Ayana's voice as she talked about isolation, about not fitting in, about being valuable, but alone. He understood that more than he'd admitted. Some men measure courage by the size of their enemy, he thought, as sleep finally claimed him. But maybe the real courage was in choosing to live again after life had taken everything. Maybe walking into that circle of warriors had been the first real choice he'd made in 3 years, the first time he'd felt something other than grief's endless weight. Maybe that was worth whatever came tomorrow. Outside, Ayana sat with her back against the ranch house wall, eyes on the stars that filled the desert sky. She'd spent countless nights like this alone, with her thoughts while her people slept in their dwellings. She was used to isolation, to being on the margins, even when physically present. But tonight felt different. Tonight she'd shared more about herself with a stranger than she'd shared with anyone in her tribe. Tonight she'd found someone who looked at her height and strength and saw something other than obstacle or threat. That was worth fighting for, worth risking dishonor for, worth whatever consequences came with the lie they were building. She'd meant what she told the elders. She'd given her word, and she didn't break her word. The fact that the word was a lie didn't change her commitment to seeing it through. That was the paradox she'd live with. An authentic commitment to an inauthentic claim, real emotion in supporting false events. Somewhere in that contradiction lay a truth she couldn't name yet. The stars wheeled overhead as the night deepened. Neither Marcus nor Ayana slept well, though both pretended to rest. They were thinking the same thing, though neither could know it. Tomorrow would either save them or condemn them. There was no middle ground, no partial success. They'd convince the council of their arrangement, or they'd face the consequences of spectacular failure. Dawn came with the kind of harsh light that made the desert unforgiving. Marcus woke to find Ayana already up, checking the horizon for signs of movement. They had perhaps 6 hours before the council would gather. 6 hours to prepare, to review their story, to convince themselves before they could hope to convince anyone else. They went over the timeline again. First meeting 2 years ago, Autumn trading venison for coffee and sugar. Subsequent meetings every few months, gradually building conversation beyond simple commerce. She'd taught him Apache words. He'd helped her understand English idioms. Small gestures of friendship that had slowly shifted towards something more personal. The spring meeting, when everything changed, when rain had forced them to talk longer than usual, when private understanding became quiet commitment. The shawl given as a token of that commitment, a bridge between their worlds. Marcus held the shawl, feeling its weight again. 3 years he'd kept this untouched, unable to let go of the last physical connection to Sarah. Now he'd use it to build a connection with someone else, someone who needed it to survive. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah would appreciate it, he thought. She'd always found poetry in life's contradictions. As mid-morning approached, they walked toward the gathering place together. Neither spoke. Words would have felt inadequate against the weight of what they were attempting. But as they walked, Marcus felt Ayana's hand brush against his, and he wondered if it was accidental or deliberate. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. Let anyone watching see that casual intimacy. Let them think this connection was real, because in some ways that mattered. It was. The council gathered in the same place as yesterday, the natural basin where two ridges met. But the morning light revealed details darkness had hidden. The elders' faces showed exhaustion from a night spent debating. Warriors from both tribes stood in formation. Weapons, visible tension, radiating like heat. One wrong word could ignite violence that would consume everyone present. The political implications went beyond individual lives. This was about honor, about tribal alliances, about how people from different worlds could or couldn't coexist. Dakota gestured for Marcus and Ayana to approach. They entered the circle together, Marcus carrying the folded shawl like an offering. Across the space, Neshoba watched with predatory stillness. His expression was unreadable, but his body was coiled like a snake preparing to strike. He knew something Marcus realized. The spy had reported, and Neshoba had spent the night planning how to dismantle their story. The eldest council member, a woman whose age showed in silver hair, but not in the sharpness of her gaze, spoke first. Her words were formal, measured, carrying the weight of tradition and authority. They had claimed an arrangement existed. Now they must provide proof beyond words. The council would listen, would examine, would judge truth from deception. This was their opportunity to demonstrate the legitimacy of their claim. Marcus stepped forward, unfolding the shawl for all to see. The fabric caught the morning light, its pattern clear and traditional. He explained in careful Apache, supplemented with hand signs when words failed, that Ayana had given him this during their spring meeting. It represented her willingness to bridge their worlds, her trust in him, her commitment to exploring what they might build together. She'd woven it herself, he said, the lie coming out smoother than truth, each stitch a connection between their peoples. Several elders leaned forward, examining the shawl from their positions. One woman, skilled in weaving herself, studied the pattern with particular intensity. She confirmed it was genuine Apache work, the pattern traditional with subtle variations that suggested individual craftsmanship. The quality was good, the work of someone with skill and patience. But Neshoba rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the tentative acceptance. The shawl was Apache-made, he acknowledged. But that proved nothing. Ayana could have taken any woven item from her dwelling that morning. The shawl's existence didn't prove she'd given it to Marcus months ago. It proved only that she was clever enough to create supporting evidence for a lie. His voice carried contempt for what he clearly saw as deception, insult added to the injury of a broken alliance promise. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Several elders exchanged glances, doubt creeping back into expressions that had momentarily softened. Neshoba wasn't finished. He'd questioned people from Ayana's band extensively the previous evening. None remembered seeing this particular shawl before. If it was important enough to give as a significant gift, surely someone would have noticed it missing. Surely she would have mentioned weaving something for the settler. Surely there would be some evidence beyond the shawl itself. The logic was damning. Marcus felt panic rising in his throat, threatening to choke off any response he might offer. This was it, the moment where their lie would unravel and consequences would follow. He'd failed. Failed Ayana, failed himself, failed to honor Sarah's memory by actually helping someone who needed it. But Dakota stood slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. He approached the shawl, running his fingers along the edge with the careful attention of someone examining evidence rather than rushing to judgment. Then he turned to face the gathered people, his voice carrying authority earned through decades of wisdom and leadership. He'd listened to accusations and denials, Dakota said. Watched both parties carefully. Observed body language and heard words spoken and left unspoken. And he'd noticed something that others might have missed. He looked at Ayana directly, his gaze penetrating, but not hostile. When Marcus had made his claim yesterday, she could have rejected him immediately. One word from her would have ended the entire situation. They would have removed him, and she would have returned to facing Neshoba's proposal directly. Yet she'd supported Marcus's words without hesitation, without the kind of pause that would suggest surprise or uncertainty. Why would she risk her honor and her people's trust for a lie created in that moment? Why back a stranger's claim unless that claim had foundation? In truth, Dakota's question was rhetorical, but it landed with force. Ayana met his gaze steadily, her voice calm when she responded, because his words were not a lie. She'd kept their arrangement private precisely because she knew her people would react with doubt and judgment as they were doing now. She'd valued discretion over approval, chosen Marcus's safety over public validation. That was her right as an adult member of the tribe who'd proven herself countless times. Dakota nodded, then turned to address Neshoba directly. The younger warrior claimed they'd fabricated everything yesterday, created proof from desperation. But consider this, Dakota said. If the shawl was taken hastily that morning, it would show signs of recent handling, dust from storage, the stiffness of fabric long unused. He held up the shawl again, displaying it so everyone could see. This fabric had been carried folded and unfolded many times. The edges showed wear from frequent touch. The material had the softness that came from regular handling, from being kept close rather than stored away. This was not something grabbed in desperation to support a lie. This was something that had been treasured, handled, often kept near. That pattern of wear suggested exactly what Marcus and Ayana claimed. A gift given months ago, carried as a reminder of connection, valued enough to show physical evidence of care. The observation was simple but powerful. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he realized what Dakota had done. The elder had looked past the immediate question of whether the shawl proved their story and instead examined whether the shawl's condition supported their timeline. And because Marcus had handled Sarah's shawl countless times over 3 years, unable to put it away permanently, unable to stop himself from touching the fabric as if that could bring her back, the wear was visible to anyone who looked carefully. His grief had accidentally created the very evidence their lie needed. Dakota continued, his voice measured and thoughtful. Moreover, Ayana's reaction yesterday spoke volumes. A warrior of her standing didn't make split-second decisions to support false claims. She was trained to assess situations quickly, to separate truth from deception, in contexts where mistakes cost lives. She would have seen through a lie immediately and rejected it to protect her honor. Her instant acceptance suggested prior understanding, not improvisation or desperation. Several elders nodded slowly, the logic settling over them like dust after wind. Neshoba's face darkened with fury, but he had no immediate counter to Dakota's reasoning. The evidence wasn't perfect, but it was consistent with the story Marcus and Ayana had presented. More importantly, it created enough doubt about Neshoba's accusations that the council couldn't simply dismiss the claimed arrangement. Dakota consulted quietly with the other council members. The discussion lasted long enough that Marcus's legs began to ache from standing rigid, afraid to show any weakness that might be interpreted as guilt or deception. Beside him, Ayana maintained perfect stillness, her warrior training evident in her ability to hold position without visible discomfort. But Marcus could sense her tension, could feel the coiled readiness in her muscles, as if she expected violence, despite Dakota's apparent support. Finally, Dakota raised his hand for silence. The council had reached a decision. If Marcus and Ayana had indeed formed this arrangement in good faith, as the evidence suggested, it would be honored according to tradition. But there was one condition that would settle all questions and remove all doubt. They must complete the marriage before sunset today. Not tomorrow, not after further deliberation, but today, in the traditional way before all gathered witnesses with full ceremony. Only then would the matter be considered settled and Neshoba's claim definitively dissolved. Marcus and Ayana exchanged glances. The look carried multiple layers of meaning recognition of what this demanded, understanding that they'd fought for the right to their lie and now had to make it permanent truth. There was no backing out now, no gradual transition from fake to real. They had hours to decide if this arrangement they'd invented out of desperation was something they could commit to for the rest of their lives. The council had spoken. The decision was final. Marriage by sunset or face the consequences of a failed deception. The sun climbed higher as Marcus and Ayana walked away from the council gathering, aware that every step was observed by warriors from both tribes. The weight of what they'd agreed to pressed down like physical force. Marriage by sunset, not a gradual courtship that might allow genuine feelings to develop naturally. Not time to consider whether a lie could transform into truth. Hours. They had hours to decide if they could live with the choice they'd made, because backing out now would mean death for Marcus and dishonor worse than death for Ayana. Neither spoke until they'd crested the ridge and dropped below the sightline of the gathered tribes. Then Ayana stopped abruptly, her warrior's composure cracking for the first time since this began. Her breath came faster, not from exertion, but from something closer to panic, barely controlled. Marcus recognized it because he felt the same crushing pressure in his chest, like the air had turned solid and breathing required conscious effort. What have we done? The question came from both of them simultaneously, words overlapping in different languages, but meaning the same desperate thing. Ayana pressed her hands against her temples, fingers digging into her skull, as if she could physically hold her thoughts together through pressure alone. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. The lie was meant to buy time, create space for negotiation, allow her to refuse Neshoba without immediate bloodshed. It wasn't supposed to become binding reality enforced by elder decree and witnessed by everyone who mattered in her world. Marcus leaned against a rock outcropping, legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. He'd walked into that gathering yesterday with nothing to lose because he'd already lost everything that mattered, or so he told himself. Now he was staring at commitment that made Sarah's death feel like something that happened to a different person in a different lifetime. He'd preserved her memory with religious devotion for 3 years, and now he was about to marry someone else. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over. Ayana saw him fold, moved on instinct to steady him even as her own world tilted. Her hand on his shoulder was meant to offer support, but the contact steadied them both. They stayed like that for several breaths, two people who'd lied their way into impossible circumstances, trying to figure out if impossible could somehow become survivable. "We can still refuse," Marcus said finally. His voice sounded hollow even to himself. He could tell the council the truth. Face whatever consequences came from that confession. Death probably, but maybe that was preferable to living a lie that would eat at him every day for whatever remained of his life. Ayana's grip on his shoulder tightened until it was almost painful. If he confessed, she'd be implicated equally. The dishonor wouldn't fall on him alone. She'd be seen as complicit in deceiving the elders, in using sacred marriage customs for political manipulation. Her standing among her people would be destroyed. Everything she'd built through years of proving herself in combat and leadership would collapse. She'd become an example of why women couldn't be trusted with warrior responsibilities, why tradition existed to keep people in their proper places. That outcome was unacceptable. "So we go through with it," Marcus said. Not a question, just acknowledgement of the only path forward that didn't end in catastrophe for one or both of them. They'd made their choice yesterday when he'd knelt in the dust and she'd supported his lie. Everything since then had been consequence, flowing from that single decision. Ayana released his shoulder and moved away, pacing like a caged predator. In her culture, marriage was sacred. Once spoken before the people, it couldn't be undone without bringing shame on both families and dishonor on the individuals involved. If they completed the ceremony today, they'd be bound. Truly bound not just in the eyes of her people, but in her own understanding of honor and commitment. She didn't enter into obligations lightly, didn't make promises she couldn't keep. This would be a promise extracted under pressure, but it would still be a promise. Could she live with that? Could she look at this man every day and remember that their union began with deception? Could she build something real on a foundation of lies? Marcus was wondering the same thing from his own perspective. Sarah deserved better than to be replaced by political convenience and desperate fabrication. She deserved to be mourned properly, to remain sacred in his memory, to not be set aside because circumstances demanded he move forward. But another thought pushed through the guilt, unwelcome but insistent. Sarah was gone. She'd died 3 years ago, and no amount of devotion to her memory would bring her back. He'd spent 3 years in stasis, preserving everything exactly as it had been, as if that could stop time or reverse death. Maybe that wasn't honor. Maybe that was cowardice disguised as loyalty. Sarah would hate this, he said aloud. The words felt like confession. She'd hate that I've been frozen for 3 years. She'd hate that it took desperation to make me feel anything again. She'd probably hate that I'm even considering marrying someone I barely know. But she'd understand why. She always understood why people did things that looked irrational from outside, but made perfect sense when you were living inside the circumstances. Ayana stopped pacing and looked at him directly. Her eyes carried intelligence and calculation, the mind of a warrior assessing tactical situations with brutal honesty. "Do you want to go through with this? Not can you, not should you. Do you want to?" The question cut through all the rationalization and fear straight to something Marcus hadn't examined yet. Did he want this? The answer surprised him with its clarity. Part of him did. The part that had felt something yesterday, when he'd walked into that gathering, when he'd knelt and reached for her hand, when he'd lied with more conviction than he'd felt about anything since Sarah's death. That part wanted to keep feeling instead of returning to numb existence. That part recognized Ayana as someone worth the risk, worth the guilt, worth whatever consequences came from choosing to live again. But another part of him recoiled from the speed of it all, from the way circumstances had forced a decision that should have taken months or years to reach naturally. That part wanted to honor Sarah properly, wanted to prove his grief was genuine and lasting, wanted to demonstrate that 3 years of mourning meant something. "I don't know," he admitted. The honesty felt dangerous but necessary. "I know I should. I know all the logical reasons why this makes sense, or at least why it's the only option that doesn't end catastrophically. But wanting something and accepting it as necessary aren't the same thing." Ayana nodded slowly. She understood that distinction intimately. Her entire life had been shaped by accepting necessary things she didn't want, accepting that her height made her an outsider among women, accepting that her strength made men uncomfortable, accepting that proving herself as a warrior meant sacrificing other aspects of life that women in her tribe expected to experience. She'd made peace with necessary sacrifices years ago, But this felt different. This felt like sacrificing her right to choose who she'd spend her life with, even as she'd chosen to back Marcus's lie in the first place. I need to know something, she said. Her voice carried the steel of someone demanding truth even when truth was painful. If circumstances were different, if we'd met some other way, if there was no pressure or desperation or council decree, would you ever have considered me? Or am I just convenient survival? The question's directness caught Marcus off guard. He could offer a comfortable lie, something diplomatic that would smooth over the complications. But Ayana deserved honesty, especially now when they were about to make vows that would bind them permanently. He thought about yesterday, about seeing her surrounded by warriors, about the moment he decided to intervene. What had driven that decision? When I saw you facing Nashoba, he said slowly, working through thoughts he hadn't fully examined, I saw someone who reminded me of Sarah. Not in appearance, but in that refusal to accept injustice. Sarah would argue with anyone who tried to force people into situations they didn't choose. That stubbornness got her into trouble constantly, but I loved her for it. When I saw that same quality in you, something in me responded before my brain could talk me out of it. He paused, making sure she understood what he was trying to articulate. So yes, under different circumstances, I think I would have noticed you. Probably would have been intimidated by you, honestly. You're formidable in ways I'm not equipped to handle, but I would have noticed. The lie about our arrangement isn't entirely false. The timeline is invented, but the recognition of something worth pursuing, that part might be more honest than either of us realized yesterday. Ayana absorbed his words, weighing them against her own observations and instincts. She'd spent years reading people, learning to detect deception in negotiations and trading situations where lies could cost lives. Marcus's words carried the awkwardness of genuine emotion rather than the smoothness of practiced manipulation. He was struggling to articulate feelings he didn't fully understand himself, and that struggle felt authentic. In my culture, she said, warriors are taught that the strongest bonds form under pressure. Fighters who've survived battles together trust each other in ways that peacetime friendships can never match. Maybe marriage is similar. Maybe choosing each other under these circumstances creates something stronger than comfortable courtship ever would. Or maybe we're rationalizing something fundamentally wrong, Marcus countered, making ourselves feel better about deception and desperation by calling it destiny or fate or whatever language makes it palatable. Ayana almost smiled at that, appreciating his refusal to accept easy comfort. Both can be true simultaneously. We can acknowledge that this began with lies and desperation, while also recognizing that those circumstances revealed something that might not have emerged otherwise. You walked into danger for a stranger. I supported a lie from someone I didn't know. Those actions tell us who we are when pressure strips away pretense. Marcus pushed off from the rock outcropping, standing straighter as something settled in his mind. They could spend the next several hours debating philosophy and motivation and whether their choice was right or wrong. Or they could accept that the choice was already made, had been made yesterday in that dust circle, and focus on making the best of circumstances neither had anticipated. We should prepare for the ceremony, he said. If we're doing this, we should do it properly. Understand what your traditions require, what commitments we're actually making, what our lives will look like after sunset when this becomes permanent. Ayana agreed. The practical focus helped ground both of them, pulled them away from spiraling thoughts toward concrete actions they could control. She'd need to return to her people, undergo traditional preparation for marriage. Marcus would need to present himself properly, demonstrate respect for customs he barely understood. They'd have a few hours apart, time to process individually what they were about to do collectively. But before they separated, Ayana caught his hand. The gesture was deliberate, conscious, carrying weight beyond casual contact. When we stand before the people this evening, she said, I need you to know that I'm choosing this. Not just accepting it as necessary, but actively choosing you as my partner. Whatever lies brought us here, the commitment I'm about to make will be real. Marcus felt something shift in his chest at her words, some tightness loosening fractionally. He'd been carrying guilt about Sarah, about moving forward, about replacing grief with something else. But Ayana wasn't asking him to forget or dishonor his past. She was asking him to choose his future with full awareness and intention. That was something he could do, something he could commit to without feeling like he was betraying everything he'd valued for 3 years. "I'll meet you at sunset," he said. "And when I speak the words, they'll be real too. Whatever started as a lie will make it truth." They separated, then each heading toward their respective preparations. Marcus walked back to his ranch alone, hyper-aware that this would be the last time it was his space rather than their space. By tonight, everything would change. Ayana would move in, and this small, failing property would need to accommodate two people with vastly different backgrounds and expectations. The logistics felt overwhelming, but he pushed those concerns aside. First, survive the ceremony, then figure out how to actually live the life they'd committed to. When he reached his ranch, Marcus found Dakota waiting. The elder sat on a rough bench Marcus had built years ago, his weathered face peaceful in the afternoon heat. Marcus's first instinct was panic worry that Dakota had come to expose the law or demand confession. But the elder's posture suggested something else. This wasn't confrontation. This was counsel. Dakota gestured for Marcus to sit beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile or awkward, just two men sitting in afternoon sun thinking their separate thoughts. Finally, Dakota spoke in careful English, showing respect by using Marcus's language rather than demanding he struggle with Apache. "I know what you did yesterday." The words were quiet but definitive. Dakota wasn't guessing or suspecting. He knew. Marcus's heart hammered, adrenaline flooding his system in anticipation of consequences. But Dakota raised a hand forestalling panic. "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to tell you that I understand and I helped you succeed." Marcus stared at him, struggling to process what he was hearing. Dakota had known they were lying, had known from the moment Marcus knelt in that dust circle. Then why had he defended them before the council? Why had he examined the shawl and found evidence that supported their fabrication? "Because sometimes truth lives inside lies," Dakota said, as if reading Marcus's confusion directly from his face. "You and Ayana lied about the timeline, about the specific events that brought you together. But you didn't lie about the connection. I watched you both carefully. The way you looked at each other, the way she supported you without hesitation, the way you were willing to sacrifice something precious to save her. Those actions revealed truth that words couldn't express." Dakota shifted on the bench, his bones creaking with age and old injuries. "Ayana has been alone among us for years, valued but isolated, respected but not included in the life most women experience. Neshoba's proposal was politically advantageous, but it would have destroyed her spirit. He's a warrior who values conquest, not partnership. She would have become a trophy proof of his dominance. That outcome was unacceptable to me, but I couldn't prevent it through direct opposition without undermining the alliance our peoples need. Then you appeared." Dakota continued. "A settler with no political value, no strategic importance, nothing to offer except genuine concern for a stranger's welfare. That action told me everything I needed to know about your character. So when you presented your lie, I chose to see the truth it contained rather than expose the deception." Marcus sat in stunned silence, reeling from the revelation that their careful manipulation had been transparent to the one person whose support they'd needed most. But if Dakota had seen through the lie, had others as well? Was the entire council aware they were being deceived but choosing to allow it for political reasons? Some saw Dakota admitted, some suspected. But I argued that suspicion wasn't proof that their claim had enough consistency to deserve benefit of doubt. I made it easier for the council to accept your story because the alternative was violence between tribes or watching Ayana forced into marriage with a man who would diminish her. Given those options, your lie seemed preferable. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. If Dakota had successfully convinced the council, revealing his knowledge now seemed unnecessary and potentially dangerous. If others learned that an elder had knowingly supported deception, it could undermine his authority and create the very conflict he'd worked to prevent. "Because you need to understand what you're walking into tonight," Dakota said. "This marriage will be real in every way that matters to our people. Ayana will be bound to you by customs that can't be casually set aside. You'll be responsible for each other, expected to build a life together, judged by how well you honor the commitments you make. The lie that brought you here won't protect you from the reality of what marriage requires." The elder stood slowly, joints protesting the movement. His hand settled on Marcus's shoulder with surprising weight. Some settlers treat Apache women as lesser. They take what they want and discard what they don't value. If you do that to Ayana, if you dishonor her or treat her as less than equal, I'll know. And I'll make sure you regret it in ways you can't imagine. The threat was delivered calmly, almost gently, but Marcus had no doubt it was genuine. Dakota had protected them both by supporting their lie. That protection came with conditions and expectations. Marcus was being given an opportunity, but also a test. How he treated Ayana going forward would determine whether Dakota's faith was justified or misplaced. I understand, Marcus said. The words felt inadequate, but he meant them. He'd walked into this situation impulsively, driven by instinct rather than planning. Now he was learning the full scope of consequences and responsibilities. Dakota was right. The marriage would be real, and it would demand more than he'd considered when he'd knelt in desperation yesterday. After Dakota left, Marcus spent time preparing himself for the ceremony. He had few clothes that weren't worn from ranch work, nothing remotely appropriate for significant ritual. But he cleaned himself thoroughly, changed into his least damaged shirt and pants, tried to make himself look like someone worthy of the commitment he was about to make. Sarah's belongings still sat in their corner, and he found himself speaking to them as if she could hear. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I've been stuck for 3 years. I'm sorry I'm moving forward in a way that feels like leaving you behind. But I think you'd want me to do this. I think you'd tell me that loving you doesn't mean stopping my life when yours ended." He picked up the brush with her hair still tangled in it, held it for a moment, then carefully removed the strands and placed them in a small wooden box he'd carved years ago. The brush itself he set aside, not discarding it, but no longer displaying it like a shrine. The boots and other belongings he began folding, carefully preserving them, but packing them away, honoring the past while making space for the future. It took hours, and by the time he finished, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. He needed to go soon, needed to present himself at the gathering place where the ceremony would occur. But he allowed himself one more moment in the house that had been his and Sarah's, that would soon become his and Ayana's, letting the transition sink in. When he finally walked out and closed the door behind him, Marcus felt something shift. Not release from grief, but acceptance that grief and moving forward weren't mutually exclusive. He could carry Sarah's memory and still open himself to new connection. They weren't contradictions. They were both part of living fully rather than just surviving. The gathering place had been transformed in the hours since morning's council meeting. Someone, probably multiple someones from Ayana's tribe, had constructed a ceremonial space with careful attention to tradition. Woven blankets marked boundaries. Stones arranged in patterns that carried meaning Marcus didn't fully understand. Small fires burning aromatic woods whose smoke was meant to carry prayers and blessings. Warriors from both tribes stood in formation, their weapons visible, but lowered in acknowledgement that this was sacred time rather than combat preparation. Marcus walked toward the center, feeling every eye on him. He was the outsider here, the settler who'd disrupted careful political arrangements through audacious lies. Some watched with curiosity, wondering how this would unfold. Others watched with hostility, believing he'd manipulated their way into a position he didn't deserve. And a few, including Dakota, watched with something closer to hope, wondering if this impossible situation might somehow work despite its unlikely origins. Ayana wasn't visible yet. She'd be preparing according to customs that required privacy and specific rituals. Marcus would wait at the center until she was ready to join him. That waiting felt endless, every minute stretching where doubt crept back in. What if she'd changed her mind during their hours apart? What if she'd decided the risk wasn't worth it, that facing Neshoba directly was preferable to binding herself to a stranger through forced ceremony? But then she appeared, and Marcus's breath caught, despite himself. She changed into full ceremonial dress, leather, and woven fabric marked with patterns that told stories through their designs. Her hair, usually practical and simply arranged, had been braided with careful artistry. She wore adornments that marked her as warrior and woman, both recognition of her dual status among her people. But what struck Marcus most was her bearing. She walked with the same confidence she'd shown in every interaction, but now it was tempered with something else. Vulnerability, maybe, or openness. She was allowing herself to be seen not just as formidable warrior, but as person entering into sacred commitment. Their eyes met across the gathering space, and Marcus saw his own uncertainty reflected back at him. They were both terrified, both wondering if they were making catastrophic mistake or brave choice. Both committed to seeing this through despite every reasonable objection. Dakota stepped forward to lead the ceremony. His voice carried across the desert floor formal and weighted with significance. He spoke in Apache primarily with enough English mixed in that Marcus could follow the essential meaning. Marriage was a sacred bond between individuals that strengthened entire communities. It required commitment beyond momentary feeling, demanded partnership through hardships that would inevitably come, asked both parties to honor each other even when circumstances made that difficult. Ayanna moved to stand facing Marcus at the center of the marked space. Even in this formal context, her height was striking. Marcus had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes properly, and he could feel observers noting that physical disparity. Some probably saw it as weakness on his part, inability to match his partner. But Marcus had stopped caring what others thought. Ayanna's height wasn't diminishment of him. It was just part of who she was, and he wouldn't diminish her by being insecure about it. Dakota asked Marcus to speak his commitment. The words had been explained to him earlier, traditional phrasing that Apache men used to bind themselves to their chosen partners. Marcus spoke them carefully in Apache, his pronunciation imperfect, but his intention clear. He committed himself to Ayanna as partner and protector, though the protection would likely flow more from her to him than reverse given their respective capabilities. He promised to honor her as equal, to support her purposes as much as his own, to build shared life rather than expecting her to simply join his existing one. Then it was Ayanna's turn. Her voice was steady when she spoke, carrying across the gathered people with absolute certainty. She committed herself to Marcus as partner and companion. She promised to bring her strength to their union, to stand with him against whatever challenges came, to honor the choice she was making with full awareness and intention. Her words weren't the same phrases Apache women traditionally spoke, Marcus realized. She'd modified them, claimed agency in ways that challenged custom while staying within acceptable boundaries. That courage, that refusal to be diminished, even in ceremony, made Marcus's chest tighten with something he couldn't name yet. Dakota called for exchange of gifts, physical tokens that would seal the commitment. Marcus had prepared for this, bringing forward a simple silver ring that had belonged to his grandmother. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but it carried generational significance. He'd inherited it when his grandmother died, kept it carefully for years, once thought he might give it to Sarah before deciding her ring should be something they chose together. Now he offered it to Ayanna, sliding it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite his attempt at steadiness. Ayanna's gift was the blade she'd carried for years, a knife she'd crafted herself and used in countless hunts and conflicts. Giving a weapon was significant in Apache culture, Marcus had learned. It meant trusting someone with tools of survival and death both. She placed it in his hands with ceremony, the weight of it heavier than physical mass alone could account for. Then came the moment of sealing the union, the physical act that would make their commitment binding before all witnesses. Ayanna lowered herself to one knee, bringing her face level with Marcus's. The gesture was deliberate, a warrior's acknowledgement of partnership rather than dominance. Their hands clasped together, rough calluses meeting, and the kiss that followed was brief but genuine. Marcus felt her lips against his, and something shifted in his understanding of what was happening. This wasn't performance anymore. This was real, carried weight that went beyond strategic necessity. The gathered people voiced their acceptance, the sound carrying across the desert like wind through canyon walls. Even Neshoba, standing with his warriors at the edge of the gathering, remained silent. His fury was visible in the tension of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, but he couldn't oppose what had been sanctified before elders and witnesses. Tradition bound him as much as it bound Marcus and Ayanna, and to reject this marriage now would be to reject the council's wisdom. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Neshoba approached. Marcus tensed, expecting threat or challenge. But the scarred warrior's words, when they came, carried grudging respect rather than hostility. "Few men would risk what you risked," he said quietly. "You surprise me, settler." His gaze moved to Ayanna, and something complicated flickered in his expression. "You've chosen your path. May it bring you the freedom you sought." It wasn't friendship or even acceptance, really, but it was acknowledgement that the conflict had ended, that Neshoba wouldn't continue opposing what the council had sanctified. He walked away with his warriors, the threat of immediate violence finally dissipating, like heat after sunset. As full darkness claimed the desert and stars emerged overhead, Marcus and Ayanna stood together watching the gathering break apart. Warriors returned to their camps, elders to their dwellings, leaving the ceremonial space empty except for dying fires and trampled earth that marked where significant ritual had occurred. "We should go to your ranch," Ayanna said quietly. "Our ranch now," she corrected herself. "We should go home." The word felt strange in Marcus's mouth when he tried to echo it. Home. A place that would now accommodate two people instead of one, two histories instead of singular grief, two futures that had to somehow merge into shared path forward. He didn't know how that would work practically, didn't know what marriage actually meant beyond ceremonial words and witness commitment. But he knew they'd figure it out together because that's what partnership demanded. They walked in darkness, guided by familiarity and starlight. Neither spoke, but their hands remained clasped from the ceremony, neither willing to be the first to break contact. When they reached the ranch and Marcus opened the door, Ayanna hesitated on the threshold. This was significant transition, leaving her people's territory to enter space that would become theirs collectively. She was crossing more than physical boundary. Marcus understood without explanation. He stepped back, making space for her to enter when she was ready, offering rather than demanding. Ayanna appreciated the gesture, the recognition that this change affected her differently than it affected him. She stepped inside finally, and Marcus closed the door behind them both. The interior felt different with her present space that had been empty, suddenly occupied by someone whose physical presence alone changed the atmosphere. Ayanna moved through the single room, examining details she'd noticed before, but now seeing them as her environment rather than his exclusively. The bed that would need to accommodate someone much taller. The table that could seat two, but felt inadequate for actual partnership. The shelves organized for one person's needs and preferences. "We'll need to make changes," she said. Not criticism, just observation. The house was designed for different occupant, and she couldn't simply fold herself into space that wasn't built with her in mind. Marcus nodded. He'd known that intellectually, but seeing her actually here made it concrete. They'd need to expand the sleeping space, probably build addition onto the structure, rearrange everything to accommodate two people with vastly different physical requirements and cultural expectations. The work would be extensive, but at least it gave them shared purpose. Building their home together might help transform the marriage from desperate lie into something resembling real partnership. "Dakota said people from your band would help us expand the ranch," Marcus said, remembering the elder's promise after the ceremony. He'd made it sound like wedding gift, but Marcus suspected it was also test. How well did the settler and the Apache warrior work together with their peoples? How well did they integrate their different worlds? The construction project would reveal whether this marriage was viable or doomed to collapse under weight of irreconcilable differences. "That's good," Ayanna said. "We'll need all the help we can get." She moved to the corner where Sarah's belongings had been noticing their absence. The space was clear now, packed away rather than displayed. Marcus saw her register. That change saw understanding flicker across her features. He'd made space for her literally and symbolically. That meant something showed commitment beyond words spoken in ceremony. But night was drawing on, and they'd both been awake for nearly 2 days straight given the stress and lack of sleep. Exhaustion pulled at them, but neither knew how to address the practical awkwardness of sleeping arrangements. They were married according to Apache custom, but they were still essentially strangers who'd known each other barely 40 hours. Sharing a bed felt presumptuous, but not sharing it felt like rejection of the commitment they'd just made. Ayanna resolved the tension in characteristic, direct fashion. "I'll sleep on the floor tonight," she said. "We should give ourselves time to adjust to this situation before forcing intimacy neither of us is ready for." The words were practical, but they carried implicit promise that intimacy would come eventually when they had earned it through actual relationship rather than ceremonial obligation. Marcus started to protest to offer her the bed while he took the floor, but Ayanna's expression stopped him. She'd made her decision, and arguing would insult her ability to determine her own comfort. He nodded acceptance, knowing they'd figure out better arrangements soon, but grateful for the reprieve tonight offered. They prepared for sleep in awkward silence, both hyper-aware of the other's presence in ways that made normal routines feel performative. Marcus lay in his bed, Ayanna arranged blankets on the floor, and they both stared into darkness, feeling the strangeness of shared space. This was their reality now. Married, committed, bound together by vows that couldn't be casually undone. They'd have to make it work somehow, find a way to transform desperate lie into something resembling genuine partnership. Sleep came eventually, though neither rested well. Both woke multiple times through the night, awareness of the other preventing the deep unconsciousness that would have been merciful. When dawn finally broke and pale light filtered through the window, Marcus found Ayana already awake, sitting up with her back against the wall, watching him with unreadable expression. "We survived the ceremony," she said quietly. "Now we have to survive everything that comes after." Her words carried weight of someone who understood that yesterday had been easy compared to what faced them now. Ceremony was temporary, bounded by ritual and tradition that provided structure. Daily life as married partners would be indefinite, shapeless, demanding constant navigation of boundaries and expectations neither had fully considered. They'd have to learn each other, accommodate each other, find ways to coexist that didn't feel like constant compromise or surrender. Marcus sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The morning felt different from every other morning for 3 years. He wasn't alone anymore. That should have been comforting, but mostly it was terrifying. He'd gotten used to solitude, to having only his own needs and schedule to consider. Now he'd have to factor another person into every decision, every plan, every moment of his remaining life. "We should start with small things," he suggested. "Learn each other's routines before trying to solve bigger problems. Know how the other likes their coffee or what time they prefer to wake. Build from mundane details toward actual partnership." Ayana appreciated the practical approach. She was warrior trained to think tactically, to break large objectives into achievable steps. Applying that methodology to marriage made sense. They couldn't transform from strangers into genuine partners overnight, but they could make incremental progress that might eventually add up to something resembling real connection. They moved through morning routines with careful politeness, navigating shared space without encroaching on each other's privacy. Marcus made coffee the way he'd always made it, strong and bitter. Ayana tried it and couldn't suppress her grimace at the taste. He noticed, asked how she preferred it, learned she'd rather have it weaker with honey if they had any. Small detail, but it meant adjusting something he'd done the same way for years. That felt significant marker of the compromises marriage would require. As morning progressed into midday, they heard horses approaching. Multiple riders moving with purpose rather than casual travel. Marcus tensed, worried this might be challenge or threat, but Ayana recognized the sound pattern. Her people coming as promised to help with ranch expansion. Dakota had made good on his word, sending workers who would spend the coming days helping them build space adequate for 2 people rather than 1. The work began immediately, warriors and craftspeople bringing materials and expertise Marcus lacked. They'd need to expand the main structure, add sleeping quarters appropriate for someone, Ayana's height, reconfigure everything to accommodate 2 people with different needs. The project would take weeks probably, and during that time, Marcus and Ayana would be constantly surrounded by her people, watched and judged on how well they worked together. But as the first day of construction progressed, something unexpected happened. Working side by side, focused on concrete tasks with clear objectives, Marcus and Ayana found communication easier than forced conversation had been. He'd ask her opinion on structural decisions, she'd consult him about placement and design, and gradually they developed rhythm that felt almost natural. By sunset, they'd accomplished more than Marcus had thought possible, and the ranch looked different, already scaffolding and partial walls marking what would become their expanded home. That night, they ate together food prepared by some of the women who'd come to help with construction. The meal was communal, shared with workers who'd stayed to complete certain tasks before returning to their own dwellings. Marcus found himself part of community for the first time since Sarah's death, no longer isolated, but integrated into Ayana's world. It was uncomfortable and strange, but not entirely unwelcome. When everyone finally dispersed and Marcus and Ayana were alone again, exhaustion from physical labor made the sleeping arrangements less awkward. They were both too tired for extended thought about what their marriage meant or what they were building toward. They simply collapsed into their respective spaces and let unconsciousness claim them. Days passed in similar pattern. Construction during daylight, communal meals in evening, exhausted sleep at night. The ranch transformed around them, growing from single-room structure into something more substantial. But more importantly, Marcus and Ayana transformed too. Small moments accumulated into familiarity. He learned she woke before dawn, naturally preferred to start mornings with physical activity rather than slowly rousing with coffee. She learned he thought best while working with his hands, that silence from him didn't mean anger or distance, but rather concentration. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences, made small adjustments that eased coexistence, built foundation of practical partnership even if emotional connection lagged behind. 2 weeks after their marriage ceremony, Dakota visited again. He walked through the expanded ranch with assessing eye-noting improvements and changes. When he'd completed his examination, he nodded approval. "You're making it work," he observed. "Not perfect, not without friction, but making it work nonetheless." Marcus appreciated the acknowledgement, but it felt premature. They'd managed basic cohabitation and collaborative construction. That was hardly proof of successful marriage. The real test would come when the workers stopped arriving daily when they were alone together without constant activity to distract from the fundamental strangeness of their situation. As if reading his thoughts, Dakota said the workers would finish within days. The structure was nearly complete, just final details remaining. Then Marcus and Ayanna would have to navigate married life without the buffer of constant company and shared tasks. That would be when they'd discover whether desperation and ceremony could transform into something resembling genuine partnership. But Dakota had other news as well, something that made his expression grave. Neshoba had left the territory with his warriors, but before departing, he'd made threats. Not immediate violence, but suggestions that the alliance between tribes was damaged, that consequences would follow from this dishonor. The political situation was more precarious than it appeared. Marcus and Ayanna's marriage had solved one problem, but potentially created others that would unfold over months or years. The threat wasn't immediate, Dakota assured them, but they should be aware that their choice had ripples extending beyond their individual circumstances. How they conducted themselves going forward would affect not just their own lives, but relationships between peoples who shared this territory uneasily. After Dakota left, Marcus and Ayanna sat together in silence processing the information. They'd been so focused on immediate survival, on making the lie believable and the marriage functional, that they hadn't fully considered long-term implications. Their union was a political act, whether they'd intended it that way or not. The settler marrying an Apache warrior challenged assumptions on both sides about who could partner with whom, what kind of families could exist across cultural boundaries. "Are you regretting this yet?" Ayanna asked. Her tone was light, attempting humor, but genuine question underneath. She needed to know if Marcus was starting to crack under pressure, if he was wishing he'd never walked into that gathering 2 weeks ago. Marcus considered the question seriously. He could point to a dozen ways his life was more complicated now than before. The expanded responsibilities, the cultural differences he had to navigate daily, the political complications Dakota had just outlined. But against all that, he'd felt more alive in the past 2 weeks than he had in 3 years. Working alongside Ayanna, building something together, being part of community rather than isolated with his grief. That vitality had value even if it came with costs. "No regret," he said finally. "Uncertainty, yes. Worry about whether we'll manage, long-term questions about whether we're fooling ourselves thinking this can actually work. But not regret. Whatever else this is, it's not that." Ayanna's expression softened. "Good," she said simply, "because I'm not regretting it either." Confused by it, overwhelmed, sometimes questioning constantly whether we're building something real or just performing a role. But not regretting. The admission created space between them that hadn't existed before. They'd both been holding back, afraid to be vulnerable about their doubts, because vulnerability might be interpreted as wanting out. But hearing each other acknowledge confusion without regret made it safer to be honest. They didn't have to pretend certainty. They could be uncertain together, and that shared uncertainty might be stronger foundation than false confidence. When the construction finally completed 3 days later, the workers departed with well wishes and promises to check on them periodically. For the first time since their marriage, Marcus and Ayanna were truly alone together. No buffers, no distractions, no excuses to avoid figuring out what their relationship actually was beyond strategic alliance and ceremonial obligation. The expanded ranch felt simultaneously too large and too small. Too large because silence echoed in new rooms and spaces. Too small because there was nowhere to hide from each other, no private corners where either could retreat when togetherness became overwhelming. They'd have to face each other now, navigate daily life without anyone else around to ease tension or fill awkward silences. That first night alone felt different from every night before. They'd fallen into pattern of Ayana sleeping on floor, while Marcus took the bed, neither acknowledging how absurd that was given. They'd added entire sleeping quarters designed specifically for shared occupancy. But moving into that new space together felt like crossing threshold. Neither had worked up courage for yet. "This is foolish," Ayana said finally, frustration breaking through her usual calm. "We're married. We've been married for weeks. Sleeping in separate spaces, like children afraid of darkness, is ridiculous." She was right, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that sharing a bed represented intimacy they hadn't earned yet. They'd exchanged vows and gifts, gone through motions of marriage, but the emotional foundation that should underlie physical closeness felt absent or at least underdeveloped. Moving too fast might break something fragile they were still constructing. But Ayana was tired of half measures and pretense. She stood moved toward the new sleeping quarters and looked back at him expectantly. Either they were actually married or they weren't. Either they were building genuine partnership or they were performing elaborate charade. She was choosing to believe the former, and she needed Marcus to make the same choice before doubt calcified into permanent distance. Marcus followed her into the new space. The bed they'd built was larger than his old one, designed to accommodate Ayana's height comfortably. It felt strange and significant, this furniture constructed specifically for shared occupancy. When they both lay down, careful not to touch, initially the space between them felt charged with possibility and awkwardness in equal measure. Ayana broke the tension in characteristically direct fashion. "I'm not expecting anything to happen tonight," she said quietly. "We're just sleeping in the same space like married people do. That's all. But we have to start somewhere, and this seems like reasonable beginning." Marcus appreciated the clarity, the removal of pressure around expectations. They were just sleeping, nothing more. But proximity itself felt significant acknowledgement that they were choosing to share space rather than maintaining careful separation. Small step, but movement in direction that felt like progress. Sleep came slowly for both of them, hyper-aware of each other's breathing and movement. But eventually exhaustion won out, and Marcus woke in gray pre-dawn light to find Ayana still asleep beside him. She looked different, like this vulnerability visible in relaxation that waking hours didn't allow. Her height seemed less intimidating, her strength less formidable. She was just a person, complicated and uncertain like him, trying to figure out how to make impossible situation work. As days stretched into weeks, they developed routines that felt increasingly natural. Marcus tended the ranch's practical needs while Ayana hunted and provided food with efficiency that humbled him. They shared meals, talked about their respective days, gradually built communication that went beyond surface politeness. Not love, certainly, but something closer to friendship, or at least respect. They were learning to coexist, to accommodate each other's differences, to find areas of compatibility in unexpected places. But challenges emerged too. Cultural differences that seemed minor and abstract became significant in practice. Ayana's people approached time and schedules differently than Marcus had been raised to think about them. She valued spontaneity and flexibility where he needed structure and routine. Those differences created friction, small conflicts that had to be negotiated through patience and compromise. Both struggled to maintain consistently. And underlying everything was the question neither voiced but both constantly wondered. When would the marriage transform from practical partnership into something more? When would respect become affection and affection become deeper connection? Or would it, was that even possible given their origins? Could something built on lies grow into authentic love? Or was their ceiling always going to be functional cohabitation without genuine emotional intimacy? 6 weeks after their marriage, something shifted. Marcus had been working on fence repairs in afternoon heat when one of the posts snapped unexpectedly, the full weight of tensioned wire whipping toward him. He tried to dodge but wasn't fast enough, the wire catching him across the torso and slamming him to the ground. Pain exploded through his ribs, sharp and consuming. He couldn't breathe properly, couldn't determine if ribs were broken or just badly bruised. Ayana had been nearby training with the weapons she maintained carefully. She heard the snap, and Marcus's choked cry was moving before conscious thought caught up. She reached him in seconds, assessed the damage with warrior's practiced eye. Not life-threatening, but serious enough that he needed immediate care and shouldn't be moved carelessly. Her hands on him were gentle, despite her strength, checking for broken bones, testing his breathing, ensuring nothing was damaged internally. Marcus found himself looking up at her face, seeing concern that went beyond obligation or duty. She was genuinely worried, genuinely afraid he'd been seriously hurt. That realization hit him harder than the wire had. "You'll be fine," she said, but relief colored her voice in ways words didn't express. She helped him to his feet, slowly supporting his weight as they made their way back to the house. Once inside, she insisted he rest while she examined him more thoroughly. Her touch remained careful, professional in technique, but somehow intimate in execution. Marcus felt his breathing change, responding to her proximity in ways that had nothing to do with pain or injury. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe acknowledgement of what had been building slowly through weeks of cohabitation and accumulated small intimacies. This wasn't strategic alliance anymore. This wasn't ceremonial obligation. This was two people who'd chosen each other repeatedly through daily decisions and compromises, who'd built something that might actually be worth the lies that started it. Ayana's hand lingered on his chest longer than medical assessment required. Marcus covered her hand with his own, the gesture deliberate and weighted with implications. For a breathless moment, they stayed frozen like that, balanced on edge of territory neither had dared cross yet. Then Ayana leaned down and kissed him. Not the brief ceremonial kiss from their wedding, but something deeper and more honest. Marcus responded without thinking, pulling her closer, despite the sharp protest from his injured ribs. The pain didn't matter, was barely noticed against the revelation that they wanted this. Both of them had maybe wanted it for weeks, but hadn't known how to cross the distance between practical partnership and actual intimacy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss alone warranted, Ayana's expression was complicated. Mix of surprise and satisfaction and something that might be fear. They'd crossed threshold, changed the nature of their relationship in ways they couldn't reverse. There was no going back to comfortable distance now. "I didn't plan that," she said unnecessarily. "Neither did I," Marcus admitted, "but I'm not sorry it happened." They looked at each other, trying to figure out what came next. The physical attraction was undeniable, now acknowledged by both of them. But attraction alone didn't solve the deeper questions about whether this marriage could be genuine partnership rather than just successful cohabitation. They'd have to continue building, continue learning each other, continue choosing commitment daily until it stopped feeling like choice and started feeling like simple reality. As evening fell and they prepared for sleep, the dynamic between them had shifted subtly but definitely. When they lay down together, there was less careful distance, more natural proximity. Ayana's head rested against Marcus's shoulder, mindful of his injury, but claiming closeness that felt earned rather than presumptuous. His arm wrapped around her despite the sharp ache in his ribs, holding her with tentative possessiveness that suggested this was where she belonged. Neither spoke, but both felt it. Something had changed between them. Transformation from people forced together by circumstance into people choosing to stay together by preference. The lie that began their relationship was fading, replaced by truth, built through accumulated days and moments of genuine connection. Marcus lay awake long after Ayana's breathing deepened into sleep, thinking about paths that led to unexpected destinations. 6 weeks ago, he'd walked into a circle of armed warriors with nothing but audacious lie. Tonight, he lay beside a woman who'd become more important to him than he'd thought possible in such short time. The journey from desperation to this fragile contentment had been strange and improbable, but somehow they'd arrived here, together, and that was worth whatever complications had brought them to this point. The lie was becoming truth day by day, choice by choice, until eventually the distinction wouldn't matter. They were Marcus and Ayana, husband and wife, building a life together because they decided that was what they wanted. Not because ceremony demanded it, not because circumstances forced it, but because somewhere in the process of pretending to be partners, they had actually become partners. Some lies, Marcus thought, as sleep finally claimed him, carry more truth than the facts they're meant to conceal. His lie had revealed something genuine about who he could be if he stopped hiding from life. Ayana's support of that lie had revealed her courage to claim her own path rather than accepting what others decided for her. Together, they'd stumbled into something neither had planned, but both were learning to value. The morning would bring new challenges, new questions about how to navigate marriage across cultural divides. But tonight they had this: peace, proximity, and the beginning of understanding that sometimes the bravest thing is choosing to trust someone with your future even when logic says it's foolish. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under stars that had witnessed countless human dramas play out in the dust and heat. Marcus and Ayana's story was just one more thread in that vast tapestry, but it was theirs. Built from desperation and lies, yes, but also from courage and hope, and the radical choice to believe that connection was possible, even when everything suggested otherwise. And as they slept wrapped around each other, with increasing familiarity and decreasing awkwardness, the ranch that had been Marcus's lonely prison began its transformation into a home they were building together. A space where settler and Apache warrior could forge partnership that honored both their histories while creating something entirely new. Where a man paralyzed by grief could learn to live again, and a woman isolated by strength could find belonging. The lie had served its purpose. Now they'd lived the truth it had revealed day by day until the distinction between false and real disappeared entirely into the simple fact of their shared existence. 3 months into their marriage, Marcus woke to find Ayana already gone from their bed. Not unusual anymore. She rose with the sun most mornings but preferred movement to stillness, needed physical activity, the way other people needed coffee. But something felt different today. The quality of silence in the house suggested she hadn't just stepped outside for dawn air. She'd left with purpose, and that purpose didn't include telling him where she was going. He found evidence in the missing weapons. Her bow, her quiver, the knife she'd given him during their ceremony, but had reclaimed weeks ago when they'd started hunting together. All gone. She'd left for a hunt then, probably tracking the elk herd that had been spotted 2 ridges over, animals that would provide meat for weeks if she brought one down successfully. Marcus felt the familiar mix of admiration and inadequacy that accompanied thoughts of her capabilities. She could do things he'd never master, survive in ways he couldn't comprehend, navigate wilderness with confidence he'd spent 3 years failing to develop. But beneath that familiar feeling ran something newer. Worry. Not about her safety exactly, because Ayana could handle herself better than most trained warriors. Worry about the distance that still existed between them despite 3 months of growing closer. She hadn't told him she was leaving, hadn't woken him, hadn't left any indication of when she'd return. That absence of communication felt like gap they hadn't bridged yet, space where partnership should exist, but uncertainty remained instead. Marcus moved through morning routine alone, making coffee the way they'd settled on together. Weaker than he'd preferred before, with honey added. Small compromise that had become habit reminder that his life wasn't entirely his own anymore. He'd adjusted to constant presence, to considering another person's needs and preferences, to having his solitude interrupted by someone who had every right to interrupt it. Most days that adjustment felt natural now. Some days it still chafed, made him wonder what he'd given up when he'd knelt in that dust circle and claimed a woman he'd never spoken to. The ranch looked different in morning light, without Ayana's presence to fill space she'd come to occupy. They'd built well over the past months. The expanded structure was solid rooms added that accommodated her height without making her feel diminished. Corrals, reinforced fencing, improved land that had been barely surviving under his solitary efforts, now showing signs of actual prosperity. Her people had help, but more than that, she'd brought knowledge of the land that his Eastern upbringing had never provided. Where to find water during dry seasons, which plants could supplement their diet, how to read weather patterns that meant the difference between preparation and catastrophe. She'd made this place better. Made him better too, if he was honest with himself. The grief that had paralyzed him for 3 years had loosened its grip, not disappeared, but transformed into something he could carry without being crushed by the weight. He thought about Sarah less obsessively, remembered her with fondness rather than aching loss. That shift felt like growth and betrayal, simultaneously progress and abandonment, wrapped together in complicated emotional territory he was still learning to navigate. By midday, Ayana hadn't returned, and Marcus found himself checking the horizon with increasing frequency. Rational mind said she was fine, probably just ranging farther than anticipated while tracking game. But irrational worry persisted, whispering scenarios where injury or accident left her stranded somewhere beyond his ability to help. He forced himself to stay busy, to trust her competence, to remember that treating her like someone who needed protection would insult everything she was. When she finally appeared in late afternoon, dragging a young elk behind her with rope and determination, relief hit Marcus harder than expected. She was covered in blood and dirt hair, escaped from its braid exhaustion, visible in every line of her body. But her eyes shone with satisfaction of successful hunt, the kind of accomplishment that fed something essential in her spirit. "You should have told me you were leaving," Marcus said before he could stop himself. The words came out sharper than intended worry, transmuting into anger that wasn't entirely fair. "I woke up and you were gone. No message, no indication of where or when you'd return." Ayana stopped rope still in her hands, expression shifting from satisfaction to defensive confusion. She'd hunted, provided food they needed. Why did that require detailed explanation and permission? Warriors in her culture didn't report their movements to anyone except war leaders during active conflicts. Independence was valued, even expected. The idea that her husband might need or want advance notice of her plans felt foreign, possibly insulting. "I'm not asking permission," Marcus clarified, sensing the miscommunication. "I'm asking for basic consideration. We're partners. When you disappear without any indication, I worry. Not because I think you can't handle yourself, but because caring about someone means wanting to know they're safe." The distinction seemed important to him, but Ayana heard it differently. She heard limitation, restriction, the beginning of expectations that would slowly erode her autonomy until she became something other than herself. She'd seen it happen to women in her tribe who married men who claimed to value their strength right up until that strength became inconvenient or threatening. She'd entered this marriage believing Marcus was different, but maybe all men eventually revealed the same desire to control and diminish. "I won't be caged," she said flatly. Her voice carried warning, the kind of tone that preceded either violence or permanent rupture. "If this marriage requires me to become smaller, quieter, more confined, then we made a mistake and should acknowledge that now before we waste more time pretending otherwise." The words hit Marcus like physical blow. He'd been worried about her wanted communication that felt like partnership rather than parallel existence. Somehow that reasonable desire had been translated into attempt at control and limitation. The gap between their understandings felt suddenly vast, unbridgeable through conversation alone. They came from such different worlds, carried such different assumptions about what marriage meant and what partners owed each other. Maybe those differences were too fundamental to overcome despite 3 months of trying. They stood facing each other across the ranch yard, the dead elk between them, like physical manifestation of the distance neither knew how to cross. 3 months ago, they'd been strangers forced together by desperate circumstances. They'd built something, since then learned each other's rhythms and preferences, developed genuine affection alongside respect. But underneath that progress ran fault lines neither had fully acknowledged until now. Cultural differences, gender expectations, fundamental assumptions about autonomy and partnership that didn't align as neatly as they'd both hoped. "I don't want to cage you," Marcus said finally. His anger had drained away, replaced by exhaustion and growing fear that they'd reached the limit of what their relationship could accommodate. "I just want to feel like we're actually together, not just two people occupying the same space. When you leave without saying anything, when you make decisions that affect both of us without any consultation, it feels like you're keeping me at distance because you don't trust that I'll respect your choices." Ayana absorbed his words, trying to understand the hurt behind them. She'd been protecting her independence fiercely because independence had always been hard-won, constantly threatened, never something she could take for granted. But maybe that fierce protection was also a wall that prevented the intimacy they'd started building from deepening into something more solid. Maybe partnership required vulnerability. She'd been unwilling to offer trust. She'd been afraid to extend fully. "I'm not good at this," she admitted. The confession cost her visible effort. "My entire life I've had to fight for space to be myself. Every time I've shown vulnerability or allowed someone close, they've tried to use that access to reshape me into something more acceptable, more feminine, more manageable. I've learned to protect myself by maintaining distance, even from people I care about." Her eyes met his, dark and troubled. "You're asking me to trust that you're different, that you won't use partnership as excuse to limit me. And I want to trust that, but it requires unlearning defense mechanisms I've relied on for survival since childhood. That's not quick or easy, and sometimes I'll fail at it because old patterns run deep." Marcus understood that intellectually, could see how her history had shaped protective walls she'd built around her autonomy. But understanding didn't erase the hurt of being kept at arm's length by someone he'd opened himself to more than he'd thought possible after Sarah's death. They were both trying, both compromising, both making efforts to bridge their different worlds. But maybe effort wasn't enough if fundamental compatibility didn't exist beneath the trying. They spent the rest of the afternoon in uncomfortable silence, processing the elk together, because the work had to be done regardless of emotional state. The familiar rhythm of shared labor eased tension slightly, gave them something concrete to focus on besides the complications of their relationship. By evening, they'd stored enough meat to last weeks, the kind of provision that should have felt like accomplishment, but instead highlighted everything uncertain between them. That night, they lay beside each other with careful space between their bodies, neither willing to reach across the distance or acknowledge its significance. Marcus stared at darkness overhead, wondering if they'd survive this, or if it was beginning of slow dissolution that would eventually leave them married in name only, bound by vows neither could escape, but unable to build genuine partnership. 3 months of progress suddenly felt fragile, like they'd been constructing on unstable foundation that was finally revealing its cracks. Ayana lay equally sleepless, angry with herself for the defensive reaction that had pushed Marcus away when he'd only expressed reasonable concern. She'd spent so long fighting for autonomy that she'd forgotten how to accept care without interpreting it as control. That inability was her failing, not his. But knowing that didn't make it easier to change patterns carved deep by years of experience and necessity. Dawn came without resolution, just exhausted consciousness that problems couldn't be solved through single conversation. They moved through morning routine with careful politeness, both aware they'd reached impasse, neither knew how to navigate. The easy companionship they'd been building felt strained, now self-conscious, where it had been increasingly natural. Marcus was checking fence lines when he spotted riders approaching from the east. Multiple horses moving at steady pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. His first thought was Ayana's people, though they usually came from the north. But as the riders drew closer, Marcus recognized them with sinking dread. Settlers, 5 of them armed and riding with the kind of confidence that suggested they expected to be received as authorities rather than visitors. The lead rider was Samuel Garrett, a man Marcus recognized from occasional trips to the trading post. Garrett owned substantial property to the east, employed numerous hands, considered himself natural leader among settlers in the territory. He'd always looked at Marcus with contempt when their paths crossed, the kind of disdain wealthy men showed those they considered failures or eccentrics. Marcus, living on the margins, trading with Apache, keeping to himself, all of it marked him as suspect in Garrett's worldview. Behind Garrett rode 4 younger men, probably ranch hands or hired muscle. All carried rifles, prominently displayed, the kind of open weapon display meant to intimidate rather than just protect. They reined in at the edge of Marcus's property, making point of stopping just inside his boundary line without asking permission to enter. Webb Garrett's voice carried across the distance, loud enough to be heard clearly, but calibrated to sound casual rather than threatening. Got a minute to talk about some concerns the community's been having? Community. The word was weapon disguised as neutral description. Marcus wasn't part of their community, had never tried to be, had actively avoided the settlers who gathered at the trading post to reinforce their sense of solidarity against the Apache territory that has surrounded them. But Garrett was claiming to speak for collective interest, wrapping whatever agenda he'd brought in a language of shared concern and common welfare. Marcus walked toward them, slowly aware that Ayana would be observing from somewhere, even if she wasn't immediately visible. She taught him basic tactical awareness over their months together, how to assess potential threats, and position himself to maximize defensive options while minimizing vulnerability. He stopped at conversational distance, close enough to hear clearly, but far enough that sudden violence wouldn't find him already within their reach. What concerns Marcus kept his voice neutral, refusing to acknowledge Garrett's implicit authority or showed defensiveness that might be interpreted as guilt. Garrett shifted in his saddle, making show of reluctance to discuss difficult matters. Thing is, Webb people have been talking. Seems you've gone native in ways that make folks uncomfortable. Marrying an Apache woman, having their people coming and going on your property, living more like them than like us. That kind of thing raises questions about where your loyalties lie. The accusation was indirect but clear. Marcus had violated unspoken rules of settler solidarity by crossing boundaries that were supposed to remain inviolate. White men didn't marry and Apache women didn't integrate themselves into native communities, didn't blur the lines that kept populations separate and hierarchies clear. By doing all of those things, Marcus had become threat to the social order Garrett and men like him worked to maintain. My loyalties lie with my wife and my property, Marcus said carefully. I'm not interested in politics or taking sides in conflicts that don't involve me. I keep to myself, trade fairly, and don't cause problems for anyone. What I do on my own land with my own marriage is my business, not the community's. See, that's where you're wrong. Garrett leaned forward, his false friendliness dropping away to reveal the threat beneath. What you do affects all of us. When one of our own starts living like them, marrying them, bringing them onto land that's supposed to be settler territory, it sends a message that undermines everything we're trying to build here. It tells the Apache they're welcome to encroach, tells them we're weak and divided, tells them they can pick us off one by one because we don't stand together. The logic was twisted but not unfamiliar. Marcus had heard variations of it before: the idea that individual choices threatened collective identity, that crossing boundaries was betrayal regardless of personal circumstances or consent of all parties involved. It was thinking that valued conformity over autonomy, that saw difference as threat requiring suppression. I'm not picking anyone off, Marcus said. My wife and I live quietly, bother no one, and expect the same courtesy. If my choices make you uncomfortable, that's unfortunate, but not my problem to solve. I'm not asking for your approval or your community membership. I'm asking to be left alone. One of the younger riders, someone Marcus didn't recognize, spat into the dust with deliberate insolence. Man who marries a savage ain't a man at all. He's something else. Something that don't deserve respect or consideration. The slur hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Marcus felt rage flood through him, hot and consuming, the kind of anger that preceded violence. His hands clenched into fists, body tensing for confrontation. But before he could respond, Ayana's voice cut through the tension from somewhere behind him. That savage is standing right here, and she's wondering if the boy who just spoke has courage to repeat his words to her face instead of hiding behind friends and horses. She'd materialized from the house without any of them noticing her approach. Now she stood at Marcus's shoulder, her height and bearing, making her presence impossible to ignore or dismiss. She was armed, Marcus noticed. Not overtly threatening, but carrying weapons in ways that suggested readiness rather than decoration. The young rider who'd spoken, blanched visibly, suddenly confronted with the reality of insulting someone who looked perfectly capable of responding with lethal force. Garrett's expression hardened. This proves my point exactly, Webb. You've got an Apache warrior on your property who clearly feels comfortable threatening settlers. That kind of situation is exactly what concerns us. What happens when she decides to call her people here? What happens when this becomes staging ground for raids against other ranches? You've created a security problem that affects everyone in the territory. The accusation was absurd and designed to justify whatever action Garrett had planned before arriving. Marcus could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the way this entire conversation had been scripted to lead towards specific outcome. Garrett hadn't come to express concerns or seek understanding. He'd come to deliver ultimatum, and the talking was just preamble to the actual threat. Here's how this is going to work, Garrett said. You're going to send your Apache wife back to her people, dissolve whatever arrangement you've made, and conduct yourself like proper settler going forward. You do that, and we'll forget this happened. Welcome you back into the community, help you rebuild your reputation. You refuse, and you'll find life very difficult for someone trying to maintain a ranch with no support and active opposition from everyone around you. The threat was unmistakable. Cooperation or isolation, conformity or consequences. Garrett was offering Marcus a choice, but one with only single acceptable answer from his perspective. Send Ayana away and reintegrate into settler society, or face coordinated campaign to destroy Marcus's livelihood and force him out of the territory entirely. Marcus felt Ayana tense beside him. She was waiting for his response, measuring how he'd handle this test of their partnership. Garrett was essentially asking him to repudiate her, to choose settler solidarity over the marriage they'd built together. The easy path would be verbal compliance promises to send her away while having no intention of actually doing it. But lies to Garrett would poison the ground between Marcus and Ayana, even if she understood the strategic value of temporary deception. I'm not dissolving my marriage, Marcus said clearly. His voice was steady despite rage still churning through his system. Ayana is my wife legally, and by every custom that matters. What you're asking is impossible and insulting to both of us. You need to leave my property now and don't come back unless you're prepared to treat us both with the respect you'd show any married couple. Garrett's expression shifted to something uglier. I tried to do this, civilized Webb. Tried to give you chance to correct your mistake without consequences. You're choosing the hard way, so be it. But don't say you weren't warned when things get difficult. He wheeled his horse around the other riders following suit. They departed at deliberate pace, not rushed or fleeing, but making clear they delivered their message and expected it to be considered seriously. Marcus watched them go stomach tight with understanding that this wasn't empty threat. Garrett had influence among settlers, could rally support for a campaign of harassment and economic isolation. Life was about to become substantially more complicated. After they disappeared beyond the ridge, Marcus turned to find Ayanna watching him with unreadable expression. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something he couldn't identify. Then she spoke, voice quiet but weighted with significance. You could have lied to them, told them what they wanted to hear, bought yourself time to figure out better response. Instead, you claimed me publicly knowing it would cost you. That means something, Marcus. Means you're choosing this marriage for real, not just enduring it because walking away is too difficult or shameful. Marcus hadn't thought about it in those terms, had just reacted honestly to Garrett's impossible demand. But Ayanna was right. He'd had opportunity to take easier path, and he'd rejected it without hesitation. That revealed something about his commitment he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. Whatever they were building together mattered more than avoiding conflict with settlers whose approval he'd never sought anyway. But the conflict wouldn't be simple or easily managed. Garrett would follow through on his threats, likely gather other ranchers and settlers to coordinate pressure. Marcus would find himself unable to trade at the usual posts, denied credit or assistance that border ranches sometimes needed, possibly facing sabotage, or worse, if Garrett decided that escalation was necessary. They'd have to be careful, vigilant, prepared for possibilities ranging from economic warfare to actual violence. We should warn Dakota, Ayanna said. This affects more than just us. If settlers are organizing against Apache integration, it threatens the fragile peace both peoples have maintained. Dakota needs to know what's developing so he can prepare appropriate responses. Marcus agreed, though the prospect of expanding their private conflict into larger political confrontation made his stomach churn. He'd wanted quiet life, simple existence at the margins where he could heal from grief without interference. Instead, he'd stumbled into a situation with implications far beyond his personal circumstances. His marriage to Ayanna was symbol now, whether he'd intended it or not. Symbol of possibility for some threat to order for others, lightning rod for tensions that had existed long before he'd walked into that gathering and told his desperate lie. They rode to Dakota's dwelling together that evening, reaching the elder's home as dusk painted the desert in shades of purple and gold. Dakota listened to their account of Garrett's visit without interrupting, his weathered face growing more grave as the implications became clear. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, thinking through angles and consequences Marcus couldn't fully perceive. This was inevitable, Dakota said finally. Your marriage challenged assumptions that powerful men benefit from maintaining. Garrett and those like him profit from keeping populations separate, from maintaining clear hierarchies, where settlers sit above Apache and presumed order of civilization and rights. Your relationship with Ayanna suggests alternate possibility that bonds can form across those boundaries, that supposed natural divisions are actually artificial constructions maintained through social pressure. The elder stood moving to look out toward the darkening landscape. That suggestion threatens their power and their self-conception. If settlers and Apache can partner genuinely, if respect and even love can develop across cultural boundaries, then all the justifications for land theft and broken treaties and systematic marginalization become harder to defend. Your marriage is a political act, whether you intended it that way or not. Marcus had understood that intellectually, but hearing it articulated so clearly by someone who'd navigated these tensions for decades made it feel more real and more dangerous. He'd walked into this thinking only about saving Ayanna from forced marriage, hadn't considered that their union would become symbolic battlefield for larger conflicts. That naivety felt foolish, now dangerous oversight that had left them unprepared for consequences that should have been predictable. What should we do? The question felt inadequate, but Marcus needed guidance from someone with deeper understanding of the political landscape they were navigating. Dakota considered carefully before responding. You continue living your lives as you have been, quietly, respectfully, without provoking unnecessary conflict, but also without hiding or apologizing for your choices. Let your relationship be example of what's possible rather than weapon in escalating conflict. Meanwhile, I'll work with other elders to ensure our people understand the situation and prepare for possibilities ranging from peaceful coexistence to renewed hostilities. He turned back to face them directly. But understand this. If conflict comes, you'll be caught in the middle. Settlers will see you as traitor Marcus. Apache will have complicated relationship with you because you're settler who's married one of their warriors, which benefits you more than it benefits our people structurally. Neither side will fully trust you, and both might seek to use you as examples or pawns in larger struggle. The assessment was bleak but honest. They had chosen each other knowing it was complicated, but the full scope of complications was revealing itself in ways neither had fully anticipated. Their marriage wasn't just personal relationship anymore. It was political statement, cultural challenge, potential flashpoint for violence that could consume more than just their individual lives. As they rode back to their ranch under stars that offered no guidance or comfort, Marcus felt weight of their situation settling over him like physical burden. 3 months ago, he thought the hard part was surviving the ceremony and learning to coexist with someone from radically different background. That had been naive. The ceremony was easy compared to defending their choice against forces that wanted to punish them for making it. Coexistence was simple compared to navigating the politics and dangers their marriage had created. We could leave, Ayana said suddenly. Her voice was quiet but serious. Ride away from here. Find territory where neither settlers nor Apache care about our relationship. Start over somewhere with less history and fewer expectations. The suggestion surprised Marcus. Ayana had seemed rooted to this land and her people in ways that made leaving unthinkable. Offering it as possibility suggested she was more shaken by Garrett's threats and Dakota's warnings than she'd shown. She was willing to abandon everything familiar if that was what surviving their marriage required. But running felt like surrender admission that Garrett and people like him had power to dictate who could live where and with whom. Marcus had already run once, fled Ohio after Sarah's death because staying meant facing reminders of everything he'd lost. That running had brought him here but hadn't solved anything, had just deferred grief and isolation to different location. Running again would follow same pattern, temporary relief without addressing underlying problems. I'm tired of running, Marcus said. His voice carried conviction that surprised him with its strength. I ran after Sarah died and it didn't help. I've been running from life itself for 3 years before you gave me reason to stop. I'm not running again. This is our home. We built it together and we're staying to defend it if necessary. Ayana absorbed his words, testing them against her own instincts and training. Warriors didn't retreat without strategic reason, didn't abandon defensible ground unless the tactical situation demanded it. Their ranch was defensible, their position not yet compromised beyond recovery. Leaving now would be premature surrender rather than tactical withdrawal. She could respect Marcus's refusal to flee, found herself relieved that he'd chosen to stand rather than run. Then we prepare for what's coming, she said. We fortify our position, ensure we can defend ourselves if Garrett decides harassment isn't sufficient and escalates to violence. We establish clear sight lines, secure our supplies, make it costly for anyone who decides to test our resolve. And we build alliances where possible, find others who might support us, or at least maintain neutrality rather than joining active opposition. The military language and tactical thinking came naturally to her warrior's response to threat assessment. Marcus found himself grateful for her expertise, for the skills and mindset he lacked, but she'd honed through years of training and experience. This was territory she understood better than he did, and he'd be foolish not to let her take lead in preparing their defenses. They spent the following days transforming their ranch from simple homestead into defensible position. Not fortification exactly, but property arranged with security in mind. Clear sight lines toward likely approaches. Supplies stored where they'd be protected from sabotage or theft. Weapons positioned for quick access if needed. Ayana taught Marcus things he'd never learned in his Eastern upbringing, survival skills that felt increasingly necessary given their circumstances. But they also maintained normal routines as much as possible, following Dakota's advice to live their lives without hiding or apologizing. Marcus tended his cattle and horses, repaired fencing and structures, did the mundane work that ranching required. Asiana hunted and provided food, maintained her weapons and skills, moved through her days with the discipline that warrior training had instilled. They were preparing for conflict while also refusing to let threat of conflict consume their entire existence. 2 weeks after Garrett's visit, the first acts of sabotage began. Small things initially: fence sections cut during the night and allowing livestock to wander. Supplies that had been stored carefully found disturbed or contaminated. Water barrels tainted with substances that made the contents undrinkable. Nothing directly violent, but clear messages that they were being watched and targeted, that their refusal to comply with Garrett's demands was carrying consequences exactly as he'd promised. Marcus and Ayanna responded with heightened vigilance, taking turns keeping watch during night hours, checking their property constantly for signs of intrusion or tampering. The constant state of alertness was exhausting, wore on both of them in ways that eroded the fragile peace they'd been building. Arguments became more frequent, usually starting from small irritations, but escalating quickly because they were both operating under stress that had no easy outlet. After one particularly bitter fight about division of watch responsibilities, they'd gone to bed angry, lying beside each other with rigid space between their bodies. Marcus lay staring at darkness, hating the distance, but unable to bridge it when his own exhaustion and fear made him defensive rather than understanding. He'd snapped at Ayanna over something minor, and she'd responded with coldness that felt like rejection, and now they were both trapped in standoff neither knew how to resolve. But somewhere in the small hours of morning, Marcus felt Ayanna shift closer. Her hand found his across the space between them, fingers interlacing with tentative pressure. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that he almost missed the words. "I'm sorry I've been difficult. I know I shut down when I'm scared, and that's not fair to you. You're trying to protect us both, and I keep responding like you're limiting me instead of working with me. That's my failing, not yours." The apology cracked something in Marcus's chest, broke through his own defensive anger to the fear and uncertainty underneath. He squeezed her hand, rolled toward her, despite exhaustion, pulling at his muscles. When he spoke, his voice was equally soft, equally raw. "I'm scared too. Not just of Garrett and what he might do, but of failing you. Of not being strong enough or smart enough to protect what we've built. I married you because it felt right, because you made me feel alive again when I'd been numb for years. But now I've put you in danger, made you target because of my choices, and I don't know how to fix that." Ayanna pulled him closer until they were pressed together, her arms wrapping around him with fierce protectiveness. "You didn't put me in danger. I was already in danger when you found me, facing forced marriage to Neshoba. You gave me escape, gave me choice when I had none. Whatever we face now, we face together. That's what marriage means, Marcus. Not protection from danger, but partnership through it." They held each other in darkness, finding comfort in proximity and shared vulnerability. The sabotage continued, the threats didn't diminish, but something had shifted between them. They'd stopped viewing their challenges as tests of their relationship's validity and started seeing them as obstacles to navigate together. That perspective shift made everything feel more manageable, less like evidence of fundamental incompatibility, and more like normal difficulties that required patience and cooperation. But the situation was escalating regardless of their internal solidarity. A month after the sabotage began, Marcus rode to the trading post to attempt purchasing supplies they needed. He'd known it might be difficult, had prepared himself for possible refusal or hostility. What he hadn't anticipated was the complete wall of silence that greeted his arrival. The trading post was occupied by half a dozen settlers. When Marcus entered, men he'd seen before in passing, if not spoken to directly. Conversation died the instant he walked through the door. All eyes turned to him, expressions ranging from hostile to carefully neutral. The trader behind the counter, a man named Sullivan, who'd always been professional, if not friendly, looked away deliberately when Marcus approached. "I need flour, coffee, and ammunition," Marcus said clearly. He had money to pay, wasn't asking for credit or charity. This was straightforward commercial transaction that should have been simple. Sullivan busied himself with papers on the counter, acting as if Marcus hadn't spoken. The other men in the trading post watched with expressions that suggested they were witnessing expected entertainment. This was what Garrett had orchestrated, Marcus realized. Complete economic isolation, coordinated refusal to trade with him in any capacity. He'd been cut off from settler community, entirely made non-person whose presence warranted no acknowledgement or basic courtesy. I can pay cash. Marcus tried again. His voice was steady despite rage building in his chest. Whatever issues people have with my personal life that shouldn't affect basic commerce, I'm asking for goods you sell to everyone else. There's no legitimate reason to refuse. Garrett's voice came from the doorway, smooth and satisfied. Sure there is. You're not welcome here anymore, Webb. You made your choice when you rejected our offer to reconcile. Now you live with consequences. No one here will trade with you, help you, or acknowledge you exist beyond minimum necessary interaction. You want supplies. Ride 3 days to the next trading post. You want community. Go live with your wife's people since you prefer them to your own. The casual cruelty in his tone made Marcus's hands clench into fists. He'd understood intellectually that this was coming, but experiencing the reality of coordinated shunning hit different than anticipation had suggested. He was being erased from settler society, treated as if his choices had forfeited his right to exist among them. That erasure was meant to be punishment, but also warning to anyone else who might consider crossing the same boundaries. Marcus left without the supplies he'd needed, riding back to the ranch with fury and helplessness warring in his chest. Ayanna was waiting when he returned, read the outcome in his expression before he had even dismounted. She'd feared this exact scenario, had warned him that settlers would make survival impossible if he refused to comply with their demands. Now that prediction was proving accurate, and they'd have to figure out how to maintain their ranch without access to the commercial infrastructure other settlers took for granted. But Ayanna had her own resources to draw on. Within days, she'd arranged alternative trading relationships through her people connections that could provide most of what they needed, even if the logistics were more complicated. Apache didn't produce coffee or some other settler goods, but they had their own trading networks that extended farther than Marcus had realized. With Ayanna's help and her people's willingness to assist, they could survive the economic warfare Garrett was waging. Yet the stress was taking its toll. Marcus found himself sleeping less, eating irregularly, snapping at Ayanna over minor frustrations that wouldn't have bothered him under different circumstances. She was equally affected, her patience worn thin by constant vigilance, and the weight of knowing her marriage had created this entire situation. They were both doing their best, but best sometimes wasn't enough when external pressure was designed specifically to break them. 3 months after Garrett's initial visit, escalation took more dangerous turn. Marcus and Ayanna woke to find one of their supply sheds burning flames, consuming stored feed and materials they couldn't easily replace. They'd fought the fire together, managed to save some of the supplies, and prevent it from spreading to other structures, but the message was clear. Sabotage was no longer limited to harassment. Someone was willing to cause serious damage, possibly risk actual violence, if the fire had spread while they slept. Dakota arrived the next morning, brought by Apache scouts who'd seen the smoke and suspected trouble. The elder examined the burned shed with experienced eye, noted details that suggested deliberate arson rather than accident. His expression was grave when he turned to Marcus and Ayanna. This is escalation beyond economic pressure. They're testing boundaries, seeing if they can destroy your property without immediate consequences. Next step will likely be direct violence, either against your livestock to cripple your livelihood or against you personally to make definitive example. You need to decide now whether you're committed to staying and defending this position or whether tactical retreat is wiser course. The question forced confrontation with reality they'd been avoiding. Could they actually defend themselves against a determined campaign of violence? Marcus had some skill with weapons, but wasn't a trained fighter. Ayanna was a formidable warrior, but she was one person against multiple potential attackers who'd have element of surprise and numbers advantage. Staying might be brave or might be foolish, and the distinction between the two wasn't always clear until after the fact. But the alternative was abandoning everything they'd built, admitting defeat, allowing Garrett and people like him to dictate through violence and intimidation what kinds of relationships were acceptable and what kinds deserved destruction. That surrender felt intolerable, even as the danger of resistance became increasingly apparent. "We're staying," Marcus said. His voice was firm despite the fear churning in his gut. We'll accept help if your people are willing to provide it, Dakota. We'll defend ourselves as best we can. But we're not abandoning our home because violent men don't approve of our marriage. Ayanna nodded agreement, her expression settling into the hardness Marcus recognized from when she was preparing for conflict. She'd made peace with the possibility of violence, accepted it as cost of refusing to submit. That acceptance wasn't recklessness, but calculation. Warrior's assessment that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds weren't favorable. Dakota studied them both, measuring their resolve and perhaps their chances of survival. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll speak with the elders. We'll provide what support we can without triggering larger conflict between our peoples. But understand that our ability to help openly is limited. If settlers perceive Apache interference in what they view as internal settler matter, it could spark violence that consumes far more than just your ranch. The limitation was frustrating, but understandable. Dakota couldn't risk wider conflict to save their marriage, couldn't put his entire tribe at risk for two people regardless of how much he personally supported them. Marcus and Ayanna were essentially on their own with limited assistance available, but no guarantee of protection if situation deteriorated into open violence. That night they discussed options and plans with sober realism, born from clear danger assessment. They could fortify better, but fortifications only worked if they were present to defend them. They could try to anticipate attacks, but anticipation required constant vigilance that would exhaust them eventually. They could seek allies among other settlers, but Garrett had apparently been thorough in rallying support or enforcing silence among those who might otherwise help. The strategic situation was poor, getting worse, with no obvious path to improvement. Yet neither Marcus nor Ayanna seriously considered leaving. They'd both decided this was where they'd make their stand, for better or worse. That decision carried acceptance of potential consequences, ranging from continued harassment to serious injury or death. But it also carried defiance, refusal to let fear or violence dictate how they lived their lives or who they chose to love. 2 days after the arson, a young Apache warrior named Dakota's grandson brought message from the elder. He'd spoken with other elders, and they'd agreed to provide limited support. Several warriors would patrol the area around Marcus's ranch at irregular intervals, not obviously protecting, but present enough to deter some attacks. Additionally, Apache traders would make point of visiting, openly making clear that Marcus and Ayanna had tribal support, even if that support couldn't extend to direct military intervention. The assistance was more than Marcus had dared hope for, significant show of solidarity that suggested Dakota had argued persuasively for their cause. But the young warrior also brought warning. Neshoba had returned to the territory ostensibly for hunting, but actually to assess situation and possibly exploit it for his own purposes. He bore no obvious hostility toward Marcus and Ayanna anymore, but he was an ambitious man whose interests weren't always predictable or aligned with others' welfare. Neshoba's presence complicated everything. Marcus remembered the scarred warrior's fury at their wedding ceremony, the barely controlled rage at having his arranged marriage stolen by settlers' audacious lie. Months had passed, and Neshoba had supposedly accepted the situation. But acceptance born from necessity wasn't the same as genuine reconciliation. If Neshoba saw opportunity to benefit from conflict between Marcus and the settlers, he might well take it regardless of consequences for the couple he had once sought to claim. Marcus and Ayanna had barely processed this new worry when another arrived. Sullivan from the trading post rode out to their ranch alone and clearly nervous. When Marcus greeted him with justified suspicion, the trader raised his hands in peaceful gesture. I'm not here on Garrett's business. I'm here on my own because I can't stay silent anymore about what's being planned. Garrett's organizing something bigger than harassment web. He's gathering men weapons minds, and he's talking about making definitive example of you. I don't know exactly when it's coming, but it's coming soon. Days, maybe a week at most. The warning was generous and dangerous. Sullivan was risking his own position within settler community by revealing their plans. His presence here would likely be reported, and he'd face consequences for that betrayal of solidarity. Yet he'd come anyway, driven by conscience or basic decency, or maybe just horror at how far Garrett was willing to go. Why warn me, Marcus asked. You've been part of the economic isolation, refused to trade with me. Why risk helping? Now Sullivan looked uncomfortable gaze sliding away from Marcus's direct question. because there's difference between refusing commerce and participating in murder. Garrett's planning violence web, real violence. He's got dozen men convinced your threat that needs elimination, that your marriage to that Apache woman is just cover for collaborating with hostiles against settlers. He's twisting everything, making you into enemy that deserves no mercy or legal protection. The words confirmed Marcus's worst fears and added new dimensions to the threat. Garrett wasn't just organizing harassment anymore. He was building narrative that justified killing framework that would let him murder Marcus and possibly Ayanna while claiming it was necessary defense against native threat. That narrative would protect Garrett legally while eliminating the example Marcus and Ayanna's marriage represented. Marcus thanked Sullivan for the warning, watched the traitor ride away with obvious relief at having delivered his message, and escaped without incident. Then he turned to find Ayanna standing in the doorway, having heard every word. Her expression was hard resolved, the look of someone who'd made decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. We need to disappear for a while. Not permanently, not running away, but tactical withdrawal to safe location while Garrett and his men expend their energy looking for us. Let them come to an empty ranch, let them find nothing to target. We'll return when the immediate threat has cooled, and we'll do it with witnesses and support that makes further violence too costly for them to attempt. The strategy made sense militarily, classic tactical retreat to avoid engagement on unfavorable terms. But Marcus balked at the idea of abandoning their home, even temporarily, of giving Garrett the satisfaction of driving them away even if they planned to return. That retreat felt like losing admission that violence worked and threats should be taken seriously enough to alter behavior. Pride isn't worth our lives, Ayanna said bluntly. She moved closer, her hands settling on his shoulders with firm grip. I've survived this long because I know when to fight and when to withdraw. This is time to withdraw, Marcus. We're outnumbered, under-resourced, and facing organized violence from people who have legal system that will protect them afterward. Fighting now isn't brave, it's suicide. Her logic was unassailable, but Marcus still struggled with emotional resistance to leaving. This ranch was where he and Sarah had built their life together. This house was where she died. This land was where he'd slowly learned to live again after her death, where he'd built something new with Ayanna that felt like future rather than just survival. Abandoning it even temporarily felt like betraying all of that, like admitting that love and commitment couldn't stand against coordinated hatred. But as he looked at Ayanna's face, saw the concern and determination there, Marcus realized his resistance wasn't really about the ranch. It was about refusing to let go of anything else after having lost so much already. He'd lost Sarah, lost his old life, lost the person he'd been before grief transformed him. The ranch represented stability roots he'd finally put down after years of feeling unmoored. Leaving it meant accepting that stability was illusion, that nothing was permanent or secure regardless of how hard you fought to protect it. Yet staying meant risking Ayanna's life alongside his own, and that cost was too high to justify through stubborn attachment to property and pride. She was choosing tactical wisdom over emotional attachment, and he needed to trust her judgment even when it conflicted with his own instincts. Where would we go? The question was capitulation, acknowledgement that her strategy was correct even if he hated admitting it. Ayanna relaxed slightly, recognizing his acceptance. Dakota will shelter us. Garrett won't attack Apache settlement directly. It would trigger war he's not prepared for. We'll stay with my people until situation stabilizes, then return with witnesses and support that makes us harder to target. It's not defeat, Marcus, it's strategy. They spent the rest of that day preparing for departure, securing what they could, and accepting they'd have to leave the rest vulnerable to whatever Garrett planned. Livestock was moved to hidden pastures Ayanna knew from her hunting. Valuable items were buried or hidden. The house was left with minimal belongings, nothing that couldn't be replaced if destroyed. It felt like preparing for disaster while hoping disaster wouldn't come. Pragmatic surrender to reality neither wanted to face. As sunset painted the desert in shades of blood and gold, Marcus and Ayanna rode away from their ranch toward Apache territory and temporary sanctuary. Marcus looked back once, seeing the home they'd built together silhouetted against dying light. The sight felt like premonition, like he was looking at something he'd never see whole again. That thought sat heavy in his chest. Weight of understanding that some things once broken couldn't be fully repaired, regardless of how carefully you tried to piece them back together. But Ayanna rode beside him, her presence solid and real. and that mattered more than structures and property. He'd learned that lesson when Sarah died, had forgotten it during 3 years of clutching at physical remnants of her existence. Now he was remembering that what mattered wasn't the house or the land, but the people you shared them with. Losing the ranch would hurt, but losing Ayana would destroy him in ways he'd barely survived once before. They reached Dakota's settlement as full darkness claimed the desert. The elder was expecting them had prepared space where they could stay for however long necessary. Other members of the tribe regarded them with mixture of curiosity and concern, seeing the settler who'd married one of their warriors, now seeking refuge among them. Some faces showed welcome recognition that Marcus had chosen their world over his own at considerable cost. Others showed skepticism or hostility, belief that his presence brought danger the tribe didn't need. Ayana handled the social navigation with practiced ease, introducing Marcus to people who mattered and deflecting potential conflict with strategic conversations. She was home here in ways Marcus never would be integrated into community that had shaped her since birth. That integration highlighted the asymmetry of their relationship. She'd left her people to live on his ranch, adapting to his world and settler expectations. Now he was in her world, and the cultural dislocation was sharp and disorienting. He struggled with language barriers that Ayana navigated effortlessly with customs he didn't understand and social dynamics he couldn't read. She'd learned English in settler ways through years of trading contact. He had rudimentary Apache and superficial understanding of their culture, nowhere near adequate for actual integration or belonging. That limitation made him dependent on her in ways that felt uncomfortable, reminded him how much of their partnership involved her accommodating his needs and limitations rather than genuine equality. But people were kind despite his obvious inadequacy. They offered food and conversation, asked questions about his ranch and his life before marriage to Ayana. Some of the warriors who'd helped build their expanded house greeted him like friend, or at least like someone deserving of respect. Marcus found himself gradually relaxing into the strange environment, accepting hospitality, even when he didn't fully understand its cultural significance or know how to reciprocate appropriately. That night, he and Ayana slept in small dwelling provided by Dakota space that was private but temporary. Marcus lay awake long after Ayana's breathing deepened into sleep, thinking about the precarious position they'd found themselves in, hiding among her people while his people planned violence against them. Dependent on Dakota's protection while hoping their ranch survived whatever Garrett did when he found it abandoned. Existing in liminal space between two worlds without secure foothold in either. But when Ayana shifted in sleep and her arm draped across his chest with unconscious trust, Marcus felt some of his anxiety ease. They were together. Whatever challenges they faced, whatever dangers waited, they were facing them as partners. That partnership had survived 3 months of sabotage, and escalating threats had grown stronger, rather than fracturing under pressure. Maybe that resilience was enough. Maybe choosing each other repeatedly through adversity was what transformed desperate lie into something resembling love. Days passed in strange suspension. Marcus helped with decks around the settlement, where his skills were useful, tried to learn more Apache and understand the culture better, made efforts to integrate even knowing he'd always be outsider here. Ayana moved between her Apache life and her role as Marcus's wife with impressive fluidity, never seeming uncomfortable in either space, but also never fully relaxed in either. They were both living divided existence, caught between worlds that remained fundamentally separate, despite their marriage's attempt to bridge the gap. News arrived on the 5th day of their refuge. Garrett and his men had indeed come to the ranch. They'd found it deserted, had searched thoroughly for any sign of Marcus and Ayana. Finding nothing, they debated what to do. Some had wanted to burn everything out of spite and frustration. But Garrett had stopped them, apparently worried that destroying property without finding its occupants would create problems he didn't want. Instead, they'd left the ranch intact, but had taken or destroyed portable items as message that Marcus's continued defiance carried costs. The damage was significant but not catastrophic. They could rebuild, replace what had been lost. More importantly, Garrett's men had been witnessed by Apache scouts who'd made their presence known deliberately. That witness meant Garrett couldn't simply kill Marcus and Ayana now and claim it was legitimate defense against native threat. Too many people knew about the organized campaign against them, about Garrett's specific threats and actions. He'd have to pursue different strategy if he wanted to eliminate the example their marriage represented. Marcus and Ayanna returned to their ranch accompanied by Dakota and several Apache warriors who made no pretense of hiding their protective intent. When Marcus saw the damage, rage and grief warred in his chest. Things Sarah had touched had been destroyed. Structures they'd built together had been vandalized. The violation felt personal and profound, attacked not just on property but on the life and memories the property contained. But the house itself stood intact. The expanded sections where he and Ayanna had learned to coexist remained whole. The sleeping quarters they'd built for shared occupancy hadn't been touched. That survival felt symbolic suggestion that what mattered most had endured despite attempt to destroy it. They could rebuild everything else. The core of what they'd created remained. Over the following weeks, that rebuilding consumed their energy and attention. Apache workers returned to help repair damage, this time with additional warriors present as clear deterrent against further violence. Garrett didn't come back, apparently calculating that the cost of another attack now outweighed the benefits. But the conflict hadn't ended, just shifted to different front. Legal challenges appeared, questions about Marcus's land ownership and whether his marriage to Apache woman voided claim that depended on settler status. Financial pressure continued, with creditors suddenly demanding payment on debts Marcus didn't know he'd been reported as holding. The campaign was exhausting, designed to wear them down through attrition rather than direct confrontation. Marcus and Ayanna fought each challenge as it emerged, but the constant defensive posture took toll on both of them. They were spending more time dealing with threats than actually living their lives, more energy on survival than on building the partnership they'd claimed justified all this struggle. 5 months into their marriage, Marcus found himself wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Not in choosing each other, but in believing they could make it work against opposition this determined and systematic. Maybe Garrett was going to win through sheer persistence, grinding them down until survival required so much energy that actually thriving became impossible. Maybe love, even genuine love, that had grown from desperate lies, wasn't enough against coordinated hatred backed by legal and economic power. He was sitting on the porch they'd built together, staring at sunset without really seeing it when Ayanna joined him. She'd been out hunting, providing food that kept them fed when economic isolation made normal provisioning impossible. She sat beside him in comfortable silence, shoulder pressing against his, and they watched the dying light together without need for words. Finally, Marcus spoke, voicing the fear he'd been carrying for weeks. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. Not the defending, I'll fight for us as long as necessary, but the constant crisis, the way every day brings new threat or problem or challenge. I feel like I'm drowning slowly, and I don't know how to stop it except by giving up entirely." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, considering his words and their weight. When she spoke, her voice carried both sympathy and steel. "Then we stopped fighting their fight. We stopped responding to every provocation, stopped letting them dictate how we spend our energy and attention. We build our life the way we want it, regardless of what they do to oppose it. They win only if they make us forget why we chose this, if they reduce our marriage to nothing but defensive survival." Her words cut through the fog of exhaustion Marcus had been lost in. She was right. They'd been so focused on defending against attacks that they'd forgotten to actually live the life they were defending. They'd let Garrett's campaign become the center of their existence instead of making their relationship the center and treating his opposition as unfortunate but ultimately peripheral noise. "Starting tomorrow," Ayanna continued, "we live like we've already won. We work on projects we care about, not just repairs to damage. We spend time together building memories instead of just fighting threats. We choose joy when possible instead of letting constant vigilance consume everything. They'll keep attacking, but we'll stop giving those attacks the power to define our entire existence." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, not of anxiety he'd been carrying, unravel slightly. She was offering strategy that went beyond tactics, vision that elevated their choices above simple reaction. They could choose to live fully despite opposition, could refuse to let hatred shrink their world to nothing but defensive crouch. He turned to look at her, really look at her, seeing beyond the warrior and the ally to the woman who'd chosen him as completely as he'd chosen her. 5 months ago, they'd been strangers forced together by circumstances neither controlled. Now she was offering him wisdom and perspective he desperately needed, seeing paths forward when he could only see walls closing in. "I love you," Marcus said. The words emerged without conscious decision. truth spoken before he'd fully realized it was truth. I think I've been moving toward loving you for months, but I was afraid to acknowledge it because it felt like betraying Sarah or admitting that our relationship was real when it started as lie. But I love you, Ayana. Not despite everything we've been through, but maybe because of it. We've chosen each other repeatedly through crisis after crisis, and that's created something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Ayana's hand found his fingers interlacing with fierce pressure. I love you too. I've known it for at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. I was waiting for you to reach the same recognition because I didn't want to pressure you or make you feel obligated to reciprocate before you were ready. But yes, Marcus, I love you. This marriage that started as desperate fabrication has become the realest thing in my life. They kissed as the last light faded from the western sky, the gesture carrying weight of acknowledgement and promise both. They'd finally admitted what had been growing between them, given name to the connection that had been developing through shared adversity and accumulated intimacy. That naming felt significant transformation from partners who cared about each other to people genuinely in love, despite or maybe because of the impossible circumstances that brought them together. The threats didn't disappear because they'd declared love. Garrett continued his campaign with determined malice. Economic isolation persisted. Legal challenges kept emerging. But Marcus and Ayana faced it all with renewed energy and shared purpose that went beyond mere survival. They were building life together now, conscious and deliberate, choosing daily to honor the commitment they'd made, with full understanding of what it meant and what it ought to. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. Other settlers started approaching Marcus, quietly offering limited trade or assistance despite Garrett's prohibition. Not everyone agreed with his campaign, and some had been silenced by fear rather than conviction. As months passed and Marcus and Ayana's determination became evident, those quiet dissidents found courage to offer small acts of resistance to Garrett's authority. Nothing dramatic or public, but accumulation of private defiance that gradually eroded the total isolation Garrett had worked to enforce. Similarly, Ayana's people grew more comfortable with Marcus's presence among them. His efforts to learn language and customs, his obvious devotion to Ayana, his willingness to accept help while also contributing where he could, all of it gradually transformed him from suspicious outsider to someone deserving of limited acceptance. He'd never be fully Apache, would always carry his settler heritage and its complicated history, but he could be Ayana's husband, who respected her people and tried to honor their ways even when understanding eluded him. 6 months into their marriage, on a morning that dawned clear and cold with promise of winter approaching, Marcus woke to find Ayana watching him with expression he couldn't immediately read. When he asked what she was thinking, she smiled with mixture of satisfaction and nervousness. I'm pregnant. The words dropped into space between them with weight of revelation and transformation. We're going to have a child, Marcus. A son or daughter who will be both Apache and settler, both our peoples trying to coexist in single person. That terrifies me, but it also feels right somehow, like this is what we've been building toward without knowing it. Marcus stared at her, trying to process information that reorganized their entire future. A child. Their child. Life they'd created together that would carry both their legacies forward. The implications were staggering, both beautiful and terrifying. They were barely managing to defend their own existence. How would they protect a child caught between worlds that remained fundamentally hostile to integration? But as he watched Ayana's hands settle protectively over her still flat stomach, Marcus felt joy break through the fear. This was future asserting itself despite everything trying to prevent it. This was hope taking physical form demonstration that their love created rather than just survived. Whatever challenges a child would face, whatever complications their dual heritage created, this was confirmation that their marriage mattered beyond just their individual happiness. We'll figure it out, Marcus said. His hand covered hers on her stomach, both of them touching the potential life they'd created. We've figured out everything else despite it being impossible. We'll figure out how to raise a child who belongs to both worlds and has to navigate between them. Together. Ayana's smile widened, some of her nervousness easing. Together, she agreed. However complicated it gets, however many new challenges this brings, we'll face them together. And in that moment, with morning light streaming through windows and their hands joined over the promise of new life, The lie that had begun their relationship felt finally and completely transformed into truth that would extend beyond their own existence. They'd started with desperate fabrication and built something authentic through accumulated choices and shared adversity. Now that authenticity would continue in the form of a child who'd carry forward the possibility they represented. The world outside remained hostile. Garrett hadn't given up his campaign. Tensions between settlers and Apache continued simmering with potential for explosion. Legal and economic challenges kept emerging. Nothing was solved or secure, but Marcus and Ayanna had each other, had the life they'd built together, and now had future they were creating. That was enough. Not perfect, not easy, but enough to keep choosing each other, keep building, keep hoping that eventually their example might help transform the larger world the way their lie had transformed their own lives. Some lies reveal truth more powerful than facts. Their marriage had been built on fabrication, but it had revealed the possibility of genuine connection across boundaries that were supposed to remain inviolate. That possibility was worth defending, worth fighting for, worth passing on to the next generation who'd continue navigating the complicated terrain between worlds that remained separate, even as individuals tried to bridge the gaps. Marcus kissed Ayanna's forehead, let his lips linger there as silent promise and acknowledgement. They'd survived the immediate crisis that brought them together. Now they'd survive everything that followed because they'd chosen to, and because that choice mattered more than any obstacle they'd face. Love built on lies could be stronger than love built on easy foundations because it required conscious choosing rather than simple compatibility. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under morning sky, indifferent to human drama and struggle. But inside their expanded ranch house, Marcus and Ayanna held each other with renewed purpose and understanding. They were building something that mattered, creating life and legacy that challenged assumptions about what was possible between people from different worlds. That work would continue day by day, choice by choice, until the distinction between the lie they'd told and the truth they'd built disappeared entirely into simple reality of their shared existence. Winter arrived with unusual severity that year, temperatures dropping faster than old-timers could remember. Snow fell early and heavy, transforming the desert landscape into something alien and unforgiving. Marcus had prepared as well as he could, but his eastern upbringing hadn't equipped him for southwestern winters that could kill as efficiently as summer heat. Ayanna's knowledge became essential for survival. Her understanding of how to preserve food, maintain warmth, and navigate conditions that would have defeated him alone. Her pregnancy progressed through those harsh months with complications neither had anticipated. Morning sickness that lasted well into afternoons, exhaustion that made her warrior's discipline feel like distant memory. Her body was changing in ways that clearly frustrated her strength, diminishing as the child growing inside her demanded resources and energy. Marcus watched her struggle with the loss of capabilities she'd always relied on, saw her face the vulnerability that pregnancy imposed with visible discomfort. She wasn't used to needing help, wasn't comfortable accepting assistance with tasks she'd always handled independently. That stubborn independence created friction between them. Arguments that started from Marcus's attempts to help and escalated into larger conflicts about autonomy and partnership, and what either of them was willing to sacrifice for their relationship and their coming child. One particularly bitter fight erupted when Marcus suggested she should stop hunting entirely until after the birth. He'd meant it practically concerned for her safety and the baby's well-being. She'd heard it as an attempt to limit her, to use pregnancy as excuse to confine her to domestic sphere she'd spent her entire life refusing. The argument had spiraled into territory that felt dangerous, both of them saying things they didn't entirely mean but couldn't take back once spoken. "You want me to become what your people think women should be," Ayanna had accused. "Safe, contained, limited to house and hearth, while men handle everything outside those boundaries. That's not who I am, Marcus. That's not who you married." Marcus had fired back with his own frustration. "I married someone I thought would be my partner, not someone so afraid of appearing weak that she'd risk her own life and our child's life to prove a point about independence. There's difference between strength and stupidity, Ayanna. What you're doing is the latter." The words had hung between them like poison, impossible to neutralize once released. They'd gone to bed angry that night, lying beside each other with rigid space between their bodies, both too furious and hurt to reach across the distance. Marcus lay awake hating himself for the harshness of his words, while simultaneously believing he was right about the underlying issue. Ayanna lay equally sleepless fury, warring with the terrible fear that maybe Marcus was right. Maybe she was risking too much to prove she hadn't been diminished by pregnancy. Morning brought no immediate resolution, just exhausted awareness that they couldn't sustain this level of conflict when external threats still demanded their attention and cooperation. They moved through their routines with careful politeness that felt worse than anger civility, that suggested strangers rather than married partners who'd declared love months earlier. But late that afternoon, as Marcus was chopping wood despite aching muscles, and Ayanna was inside preparing food with visible reluctance, Dakota arrived with news that forced their personal conflict into temporary background. Garrett was organizing something significant. The elder's face was grave as he delivered the information, voice carrying weight of serious threat assessment. Multiple settlers had been gathering at Garrett's property over the past week. Weapons had been stockpiled, horses prepared for travel. The spy network Apache maintained had observed preparations that suggested imminent action, something larger than previous harassment or sabotage attempts. Moreover, legal authorities in the nearest town had apparently given Garrett tacit permission to handle the situation with Marcus and Ayanna as he saw fit. The sheriff, a man sympathetic to settler interests and hostile to Apache integration, had reportedly told Garrett that if the problem resolved itself through private action, law enforcement would be slow to investigate and quick to conclude that whatever happened was justified defense against native threat. That official sanction, unofficial as it might be, changed the calculus entirely. Garrett could now act with assumption that he'd face no legal consequences, regardless of what he did. That freedom made him infinitely more dangerous, removed the constraints that had limited his previous actions to deniable sabotage and economic pressure. "How long until they move?" Marcus asked. His mind was already shifting into tactical mode, personal grievances set aside in face of immediate danger. "Days at most," Dakota said. "Maybe less. My scouts will try to provide warning when they actually depart, but weather makes observation difficult. You should assume they could arrive with little or no advance notice." Ayanna moved to stand beside Marcus, their earlier conflict forgotten, or at least subordinated to shared threat. Her hand found his automatically fingers interlacing with pressure that communicated what words couldn't. Whatever came, they'd face it together. That unity felt more important than any argument about hunting or autonomy or the proper way to navigate pregnancy's limitations. "We need to decide our response now," Ayanna said. Her voice carried the tactical clarity Marcus had learned to trust. "Do we evacuate again and seek shelter with my people? Do we fortify here and prepare to defend ourselves? Do we try to arrange mediation or negotiation before violence erupts?" Each option had significant drawbacks. Evacuating felt cowardly and would likely just delay the confrontation rather than prevent it. Fortifying meant potential battle they were poorly positioned to win. Negotiation assumed Garrett had any interest in resolution, short of their complete capitulation or elimination assumption that seemed increasingly untenable given his escalating actions. Before anyone could voice preference, Dakota offered unexpected alternative. "What if you weren't here when they arrived, not evacuated to obvious refuge but disappeared entirely? Let them come to empty ranch, again expend their energy on fruitless search. Then return when they've given up with enough witnesses and support that further violence becomes too costly." The strategy was similar to what they'd done before, but with key difference. Last time they'd hidden with Ayanna's people location Garrett could have identified with effort. This time Dakota was suggesting more complete disappearance, going somewhere neither settlers nor Apache would think to look. That anonymity would provide better protection, but also more complete isolation if something went wrong. "Where would we go?" Marcus asked. His geographical knowledge of the territory was limited compared to both Ayanna and Dakota. He knew his ranch and the immediate surrounding area, knew the route to Ayanna's settlement and to the trading posts. Beyond that, he was largely ignorant of what the landscape offered. Dakota described a location 3 days' ride to the northwest, a canyon system that provided natural shelter and resources, but was remote enough that few people traveled there. He'd used it himself in his younger years when circumstances required temporary refuge. It would be harsh living, especially in winter conditions, especially with Ayanna pregnant and Marcus inexperienced in wilderness survival. but it would be safe from Garrett and his men give them time to outlast whatever immediate threat was building. The plan made tactical sense, but felt like defeat nonetheless. They'd be abandoning their home again, ceding ground to enemy who wanted nothing more than to drive them away permanently. Every retreat, even strategic ones, felt like giving Garrett exactly what he wanted. But the alternative was standing and fighting when the odds were catastrophically unfavorable, risking not just their lives, but their unborn child's future. "We'll go," Ayanna decided. Her hand moved to her stomach, the gesture increasingly habitual as pregnancy progressed. "I won't risk our child to prove a point about standing ground. We'll disappear, survive winter, and return when circumstances are more favorable." Marcus nodded agreement, though the decision sat heavy in his chest. He'd already lost one home when Sarah died. Now he was effectively losing another, at least temporarily. The ranch represented years of effort, contained memories he valued even as he'd learned to live beyond them. Walking away felt like amputation, necessary perhaps, but deeply painful. They spent that evening preparing for departure, packing in only what they could carry on 2 horses: food, warm clothing, basic supplies. They'd have to leave everything else vulnerable to whatever Garrett did when he arrived. Marcus found himself touching objects with something like farewell, recognizing he might never see them again. Furniture he and Sarah had built together. Tools he'd relied on for years. The expanded sections of the house where he and Ayanna had learned to coexist and eventually to love each other. All of it felt fragile, suddenly temporary, despite the effort invested in creating it. Maybe that was life's fundamental truth, Marcus thought. Nothing was permanent. Everything could be taken, and the only constant was the choice to keep building, despite knowing how easily it could all collapse. As they prepared to sleep, their last night before departure, Ayanna spoke quietly from where she lay beside him. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier, about you wanting to make me into something I'm not. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't true. You've never tried to limit me, Marcus. I was projecting my fears onto you instead of acknowledging that pregnancy scares me because it makes me vulnerable in ways I've spent my life avoiding." Marcus rolled toward her, his hand finding her face in the darkness. "I'm sorry too. Calling you stupid was cruel and inaccurate. You're the smartest person I know, and you've kept us alive through situations that would have destroyed me alone. I was scared not for me, but for you and the baby, and I let that fear make me harsh instead of supportive." They held each other in the darkness, both aware that tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties. But the conflict between them had been resolved, or at least addressed honestly enough that it no longer festered. They understood each other better now, understood the fears and insecurities that drove their defensive reactions. That understanding wouldn't prevent future arguments, but it might help them navigate those conflicts with more grace and less damage. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that made breathing painful and movement sluggish. Marcus and Ayanna loaded their horses efficiently, working together with the coordination they developed through months of partnership. Dakota had left the previous evening with promise to guide them to the canyon refuge, but he'd be meeting them several miles from the ranch to avoid creating obvious trail Garrett's men might follow. As Marcus took one last look at their home before mounting his horse, he felt the weight of everything they were leaving behind. Not just physical property, but the life they'd built, the daily routines that had become comfortable, the sense of permanence they'd started to believe in, despite knowing how precarious their situation remained. But Ayanna was already mounted and waiting, her presence pulling him toward future rather than letting him linger in attachment to what they were abandoning. He climbed into his saddle, turned his horse to follow hers, and they rode away from the ranch as a morning sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. The journey to the canyon was brutal. Winter conditions that were merely uncomfortable around their ranch became actively hostile in the open terrain between. Wind cut through clothing with knife precision, cold that made fingers and toes go numb within hours, despite their best efforts at protection. The horses struggled through snow that was deeper than anticipated, each mile taking far longer than it should have under normal conditions. Ayanna's exhaustion was visible by the second-day pregnancy, combined with harsh travel draining her energy faster than she could replenish it. Marcus watched her push through obvious discomfort without complaint, warrior's discipline overriding her body's protests. That discipline impressed him while simultaneously making him anxious. She was suffering and refusing to acknowledge it, pushing herself beyond wise limits because admitting weakness still felt unacceptable. When they finally reached the canyon, Dakota had described relief was profound but short-lived. Yes, the location provided shelter from wind and some protection from the elements. But it was also a remote, isolated, harsh environment for survival even under ideal circumstances. With Ayana pregnant and Marcus's survival skills limited, they'd be challenged to make it through weeks or potentially months of winter refuge. Dakota helped them establish basic camp, showed Marcus techniques for maintaining fire and finding water and preparing food from limited resources. The elder stayed 2 days to ensure they had adequate foundation for survival, then departed with promise to return when he had news about Garrett's actions or when circumstances allowed their safe return home. His departure left Marcus and Ayana completely alone in wilderness that felt alien and threatening. They had each other, had supplies that should last if carefully managed, had shelter that was adequate if not comfortable. But they also had isolation that was absolute, no community to fall back on if something went wrong, no help available if emergency arose. The first week was adaptation and learning. Marcus absorbed everything Ayana taught him about surviving in harsh conditions, skills she'd learned from childhood, but that were entirely new to him. How to recognize signs of hypothermia before it became critical. How to melt snow for water efficiently. How to maintain fire through the night without exhausting their fuel supply. How to read weather patterns that could mean the difference between manageable discomfort and life-threatening danger. But as days stretched into weeks, the isolation began to affect them both. Ayana grew increasingly introspective, spending long periods staring into the fire without speaking. Marcus recognized the signs of someone wrestling with thoughts and fears they couldn't articulate, but his attempts to draw her out were met with deflection or silence. She was processing something alone, and he didn't know how to reach across that distance to offer support she clearly didn't know how to accept. His own mental state deteriorated as well. Being alone with his thoughts for extended periods meant confronting questions and doubts he'd successfully avoided through constant activity in external crisis. Had he made the right choice marrying Ayana? Was their love genuine or just trauma bonding in desperate circumstances, creating illusion of deeper connection? Would their child thank them for bringing it into a world that didn't want them to exist together? Or would they someday resent parents who'd chosen defiance over their child's safety? Those questions had no satisfying answers, but they circled endlessly through Marcus's mind during long winter nights when sleep was elusive and darkness felt oppressive. He found himself thinking about Sarah more than he had in months, remembering their easy compatibility and uncomplicated love. His relationship with Sarah had never required this level of constant negotiation and conflict. They'd fit together, naturally shared worldview and values that meant they rarely disagreed on fundamental issues. With Ayana, everything was harder, required more effort, demanded constant adjustment and compromise. Did that difficulty mean their relationship was fundamentally flawed? Or did it mean they were building something more resilient than easy compatibility could ever create? 6 weeks into their canyon refuge, Ayana's water broke. It was too early. She wasn't due for another month at least, maybe 6 weeks. But her body had decided otherwise, responding to stress and harsh conditions by initiating labor prematurely. Marcus felt terror surge through him as he recognized what was happening, understanding with brutal clarity that they were facing medical emergency without access to help or expertise. Ayana was afraid too. He could see it in her eyes despite her attempts at controlled composure. Premature birth was dangerous under ideal circumstances. Out here in Winter Canyon with no midwife or medical assistance, it could easily be fatal for mother-child or both. But fear wouldn't change, reality wouldn't delay what her body had already decided was happening. Labor lasted 14 hours, longest 14 hours of Marcus's life, watching Ayana cycle through pain and effort and exhaustion that pushed her to limits he'd never witnessed. She didn't scream or cry out, maintained warrior's stoic endurance, even as her body was racked with contractions that clearly caused agony. But her hand gripped his with crushing force, silent plea for support and anchor when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. Marcus did what he could, which felt utterly inadequate. He boiled water because that's what people did in these situations, even if he didn't fully understand why. He spoke encouragement that sounded hollow to his own ears. He held her hand and let her break his fingers if that's what she needed. He prayed to God he wasn't sure he believed in any more, bargained with the universe to let them both survive this. When their daughter finally emerged into the world, she was tiny and blue and terrifyingly still. For a horrible moment, Marcus thought they'd lost her, that she'd been too premature to survive. But then she gasped, coughed, and released a thin wail that was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. Ayana was crying, tears streaming down her face as Marcus placed their daughter on her chest, both of them staring at the impossibly small life they'd created. She was perfect, tiny but apparently healthy, with features that blended both her parents in ways that made her simultaneously familiar and entirely new. She had Ayana's dark eyes and hair, Marcus's nose and chin structure. She was both Apache and settler physical embodiment of the bridge they'd been trying to build between worlds that remained separate. "We'll call her Sarah," Ayana said. Her voice was exhausted but certain. "After your first wife, because she should know that she's named for someone who valued justice and compassion, who would have welcomed her even if others won't." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He'd thought naming their daughter after Sarah would feel like betrayal or confusion of past and present. But Ayana was right. It was honor to both women, acknowledgement that Sarah's values lived on through this new life, that the love Marcus had carried for his first wife didn't diminish what he'd built with his second. They spent the next days in exhausted haze of new parenthood. Little Sarah was demanding in ways that allowed neither of them adequate sleep, requiring constant feeding and attention that left them both stumbling through fog of exhaustion. But she was also miracle confirmation that their love had created, rather than just survived, that their partnership had produced legacy that would continue after they were gone. Marcus found himself utterly transformed by fatherhood. Every cry from Sarah sent panic through his system, fear that something was wrong or that he was failing to provide what she needed. But every moment when she calmed in his arms or looked at him with unfocused infant eyes made him understand that he'd do anything to protect this small life sacrifice, anything to give her a better future than the conflict and hatred that had surrounded her parents' union. Ayana adapted to motherhood with characteristic intensity, bringing her warrior's discipline to feeding schedules and infant care with the same focus she'd once applied to combat training. But Marcus also saw vulnerability in her that she rarely displayed, moments when she'd hold Sarah and whisper to her in Apache about the world she'd been born into and the strength she'd need to navigate it. They were still in the canyon refuge, still isolated and surviving on dwindling supplies, still uncertain when or if they'd be able to return home safely. But they had each other, and now they had Sarah, and those connections felt more important than any external threat or challenge. 2 weeks after Sarah's birth, Dakota returned with news that transformed everything. Garrett was dead, killed not by Apache or by Marcus's supporters among settlers, but by his own greed and miscalculation. He tried to claim Marcus's abandoned ranch as forfeit property, had begun filing legal documents to transfer ownership. But in the process of that documentation, other settlers had learned about various illegal activities Garrett had been conducting. Land fraud, theft, extortion of neighbors too weak to resist. The exposure had triggered investigation that revealed systematic corruption. One of the ranchers Garrett had been extorting had apparently decided that legal resolution was too slow and uncertain. He'd confronted Garrett with witnesses present, and when Garrett had reached for his weapon, the rancher had shot him dead. Self-defense witnesses confirmed. Legal authorities had no choice but to accept that verdict, and the man who'd organized systematic campaign against Marcus and Ayana was gone. His death had fractured the coalition he'd built. Without his driving force and intimidation, many settlers who'd participated in the harassment campaign had quietly withdrawn. Some felt guilty about their participation, others simply lost interest when the personal cost of continued opposition exceeded the abstract benefits. The organized resistance that had made Marcus and Ayana's life impossible had largely dissolved. "You can come home," Dakota said. His weathered face showed satisfaction at delivering good news for once. "There will still be those who disapprove of your marriage, who'll make life difficult through smaller means. But the existential threat is past. You can rebuild without constant fear of violence." The news should have brought relief, celebration, immediate preparation for return. But Marcus found himself feeling something more complicated. Garrett's death felt like anticlimactic resolution to conflict that had consumed their lives for months. They'd prepared for final confrontation, some dramatic stand where they'd prove their love and commitment against organized hatred. Instead, the threat had simply ended through circumstances unrelated to their choices or actions. It felt like story without proper ending, conflict resolved through deus ex machina rather than through protagonist's efforts. Marcus recognized the absurdity of being disappointed that he hadn't had to fight and possibly die for his marriage. But humans needed narrative satisfaction, needed to feel that their struggles led somewhere meaningful rather than just ending arbitrarily when convenient villain died unexpectedly. "We should wait until spring to return," Ayana said. She was holding Sarah the infant, feeding contentedly. "Travel now with a newborn would be dangerous, and we have shelter and supplies here for another month or two. Better to let weather improve and Sarah grow stronger before we attempt the journey." Her reasoning was sound, but Marcus suspected it was also delay tactic. She was as uncertain as he was about what returning home meant now that the immediate threat had passed. They'd defined themselves through opposition and survival for so long that removing that external pressure left them uncertain about what their relationship looked like without constant crisis to unite them against. But they had time now. Time to figure out who they were as couple rather than just as partners in survival. Time to learn how to be parents. Time to imagine a future that extended beyond immediate threats and tactical responses. That time felt luxurious after months of constant vigilance and crisis management. The remaining weeks in the canyon passed with strange domesticity. They fell into routines around Sarah's needs, learned to coordinate their efforts in caring for her, discovered small joys in watching her develop and respond to their voices and touch. Marcus had never imagined he'd be father again after Sarah's death seemed to close that door permanently. Now he had a daughter who depended on him completely, who'd grow up navigating between worlds in ways he couldn't fully prepare her for, but could support through presence and commitment. Ayana bloomed in motherhood despite her earlier fears about how pregnancy would limit her. She remained warrior but had added dimension of fierce maternal protectiveness that made her seem even more formidable. Marcus watched her with their daughter and felt love deepen into something that went beyond romantic attachment or partnership. They were family now, bound not just by vows and choices, but by the small life that depended on them both. When spring finally arrived and travel became feasible, they packed their limited belongings and began the journey back to the ranch. The trip was slower, with an infant required more frequent stops for feeding and rest. But weather was merciful, and they reached their property as afternoon sun painted familiar landscape in welcoming light. The ranch looked different. Not destroyed as Marcus had feared during darker moments of canyon isolation, but clearly changed. Someone had maintained it during their absence. Fences had been repaired, structures reinforced against winter damage. Inside the house, they found supplies, stocked firewood, ranged evidence of care that suggested friends rather than enemies had visited. A note on the table explained, Sullivan the trader who'd warned Marcus about Garrett's plans had organized quiet maintenance effort among settlers who'd never supported the harassment campaign, but had been too afraid of Garrett to openly oppose him. Now that Garrett was dead and his coalition fractured, they'd found courage to demonstrate support through actions rather than just private sympathy. The gesture moved Marcus, deeply proof that their community wasn't monolithic in its hatred or resistance to integration. Some had always recognized the fundamental injustice of Garrett's campaign, but had lacked means or courage to oppose it when he was alive and powerful. Those people were offering reconciliation, now tentative bridge toward acceptance, that might eventually allow Marcus and Ayana to exist without constant opposition. But other signs suggested not everyone had abandoned hostility. Marks on fencing that looked like someone had started to damage it before stopping or being interrupted. Messages carved into wood that contained slurs and threats, evidence of surveillance observers who'd watched the property during their absence. The organized campaign had ended, but individual resistance remained. Life wouldn't be easy, Marcus realized. They'd still face prejudice and difficulties, still have to navigate worlds that fundamentally rejected their union's legitimacy. But the existential threat had passed, and that made the remaining challenges feel manageable in comparison. Over the following weeks, they worked to restore the ranch to full functionality. Ayana's people came to help, as did several settlers who'd been part of Sullivan's maintenance effort. The two groups worked together awkwardly, cultural differences and historical tensions, making easy cooperation impossible. But they worked together, nonetheless united by respect for Marcus and Ayana's determination, and by growing recognition that maybe integration was possible if people chose to attempt it, rather than reflexively opposing it. Little Sarah became symbol of that possibility. Settlers who'd never interacted with the Apache came to see the baby, their curiosity overcoming their prejudice. Apache, who'd been skeptical of Marcus, found themselves charmed by his obvious devotion to his daughter. She was bridge between peoples in ways her parents could never be innocent of the history and conflict that complicated every adult interaction. Marcus watched these interactions with mixture of hope and apprehension. Sarah would grow up navigating between worlds in ways he could only partially understand or prepare her for. She'd face questions about identity and belonging that had simple answers for people who fit clearly into single category, but would be complicated for her. She'd be too Apache for some settlers, too settler for some Apache perpetually caught between worlds that wanted clear boundaries rather than mixed heritage. But she'd also have possibilities neither parent had experienced. She could move between communities with legitimacy her parents lacked. She could choose which cultural practices to embrace and which to set aside. She could define herself rather than being defined by others' expectations. That freedom came with costs, but it also came with opportunities that might eventually transform the rigid divisions her parents had challenged through their marriage. 6 months after returning to their ranch, unexpected visitor arrived. Neshoba the warrior, who'd once sought to force Ayana into marriage, rode up with a small group of his people. Marcus tensed immediately, hand moving toward weapon, even as he recognized the futility of armed resistance if Neshoba had come for violence. But Neshoba raised his hand in peaceful gesture, dismounting with deliberate calm. When he spoke, his voice carried respect rather than hostility. "I've come to acknowledge what you've built here," he said to both Marcus and Ayana. "I was angry when you disrupted the arranged marriage, believed you'd insulted my honor, and undermined important alliance between our tribes. But I've watched how you've survived opposition from your people and lived with integrity among hers. I've heard about your daughter, about the bridge you're building, whether others want it or not." He paused, something working in his scarred face that suggested internal conflict. "You were right to refuse me, Ayana. I wanted you as trophy proof of my status and power. I wasn't prepared to be actual partner to someone with your strength and independence. You chose better when you backed this settler's lie, because he at least was willing to actually see you rather than just possess you." The acknowledgement was generous and clearly difficult for Neshoba to voice. His pride had taken substantial blow when Ayana had escaped his arranged marriage through Marcus's desperate intervention. But he'd grown, or at least gained perspective, in the months since learned to separate wounded pride from actual injustice. Ayana inclined her head with respect. "That you honor us with your understanding. That took courage and we recognize it." She hesitated, then added something that clearly meant more than surface words suggested. "The man you were then wasn't ready for partnership I required. But the man you're becoming might be ready for someone who deserves the respect you're learning to offer. Don't let wounded pride prevent you from finding actual connection with someone who can match you." Neshoba absorbed her words, nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised everyone present. He produced a small carved cradle from his pack, beautifully crafted and marked with protective symbols from Apache tradition. "For your daughter," he said, "so she knows that even those who opposed your union can recognize its legitimacy when they choose to see clearly." The gift was a profound gesture of reconciliation, symbol that opposition could transform into acceptance when people were willing to evolve their understanding. Marcus accepted it with gratitude that went beyond the object itself. Recognition that Neshoba was offering bridge where there had been only hostility before. After Neshoba departed, Ayana held the cradle and cried quietly. Marcus knew the tears weren't just about Neshoba's unexpected grace, but about everything they'd survived to reach this point. The desperate lie told in dust circle that had felt like last desperate grasp at agency. The ceremony that had bound them when they barely knew each other. The months of learning to coexist and then to actually love each other. The opposition that had threatened to destroy them. The isolation in Winter Canyon. The premature birth that could have killed Ayana, or Sarah, or both. All of it leading to this moment where former enemy acknowledged their love's legitimacy and offered blessing for their future. They'd earned this, Marcus thought, not through perfection or easy compatibility, but through stubborn commitment to choosing each other repeatedly despite every obstacle and doubt. Their love wasn't a story of love at first sight or perfect romance. It was a story of two broken people who'd found each other through desperation and built something real through accumulated choices and refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. That kind of love was messy and complicated and required constant work. But it was also resilient in ways easy love could never be tested through fires that would have destroyed relationships built on less solid foundation. They'd lied their way into commitment, but they'd chosen their way into love. That transformation was worth everything it had cost them. As their first year of marriage approached, Marcus found himself taking stock of how far they'd traveled from that desperate moment in the dust circle. He'd been broken man, then paralyzed by grief and unable to imagine future that held anything except numb survival. Ayana had been warrior facing forced marriage that would have diminished everything she was. Now they were partners in every sense that mattered. They ran their ranch together, making decisions jointly and supporting each other through challenges neither could handle alone. They were raising daughter who'd grow up knowing both worlds and hopefully transcending the divisions that had made her parents' union so controversial. They were building life that honored both their heritages while creating something new that belonged to neither culture exclusively. On their anniversary, they held private ceremony. Just the two of them and Sarah, no witnesses or formal ritual. They spoke vows again, but real ones this time. Not words chosen to satisfy tradition or convince others of their commitment, but honest expression of what they meant to each other and what they promised going forward. Marcus promised to honor Ayana's strength while supporting her when strength wasn't enough. Promised to raise Sarah knowing both her heritages and help her navigate the complicated terrain between worlds. Promised to keep choosing Ayana daily, not because ceremony bound him, but because she was who he wanted beside him through whatever came next. Ayana promised to trust Marcus with her vulnerability while maintaining the independence that made her who she was. Promised to build life that honored his past with Sarah while creating future that belonged to them both. Promised to keep choosing him not despite their differences, but because those differences challenged her to grow beyond the limitations her original world had tried to impose. They renewed commitment that had started with lies and desperation, but had transformed through daily choices into something that felt more real than any relationship built on easier foundation. Some lies revealed deeper truth than facts could capture. Their marriage was proof of that principle demonstration that sometimes the most authentic connections emerge from the most improbable circumstances. 2 years after their marriage, another child arrived, a son, this time healthy and full term, born in their ranch home with Apache midwife attending and several settler women present who'd overcome their prejudice enough to offer support. They named him Thomas after Marcus's father, giving him settler name as they'd given their daughter Apache name. Balance between worlds, effort to honor both heritages equally. Their family grew, and with it the example they represented. Other marriages began to form across cultural boundaries, people emboldened by Marcus and Ayana's survival to pursue their own unlikely partnerships. Not many and still controversial, but enough to suggest that the walls between worlds were becoming permeable rather than absolute. Garrett's death had created space for this evolution, removed the organized opposition that had enforced strict separation. But Marcus and Ayana's determination had created the example that showed integration was possible. They hadn't set out to be symbols or pioneers. They'd just been two desperate people who'd chosen each other in moment of crisis and then refused to unchoose each other despite every pressure to do so. That refusal to surrender to others' expectations and limitations was their legacy. Not perfect integration or erasure of cultural differences, but demonstration that commitment and love could bridge divisions if people were willing to do the difficult work required. Their children would carry that legacy forward, would face their own challenges and choices in navigating between worlds. But they'd do so knowing their parents had chosen love over conformity, had built life together despite everything that said they shouldn't. 5 years after the lie that had started everything, Marcus sat on the porch he'd rebuilt, with Ayana's help, watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was teaching Thomas some games she had learned from Apache children, mixture of languages and cultural practices that reflected her own hybrid identity. They were happy, secure in their parents' love, and largely oblivious to the controversy their existence represented. Ayana joined him, settling beside him with the comfortable ease of long partnership. They'd been through so much together, survived challenges that would have destroyed most relationships. But they'd made it not intact, but transformed, not unchanged, but stronger for the changes they had undergone. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked. The question was old one between them, asked periodically when reflection overwhelmed immediate concerns. The answer was always some variation of no, but the asking itself felt important acknowledgement that their choice had been costly, even as it had been worthwhile. Ayana considered before responding, giving the question the weight it deserved. I regret that we had to fight so hard for something that should have been simple. I regret the threats and violence and constant struggle. I regret that our children will face prejudice and difficulty because of who their parents are. But do I regret choosing you? Do I regret the life we've built? No, never. This is exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want beside me. Marcus felt familiar warmth in his chest, the feeling that had replaced grief's endless ache. He'd loved Sarah and he loved Ayana, different loves that didn't diminish each other but existed simultaneously. He'd learned that humans had capacity for multiple loves across their lifetimes. That new connection didn't erase previous one but added to the accumulated experiences that made person complete. I tell myself I walked into that gathering because it was right thing to do, he said, because I saw injustice and couldn't walk away. But I think part of me was just desperate to feel anything except numb grief. You gave me reason to care again, reason to fight for something instead of just enduring. That was gift I didn't deserve, but that I'm grateful for daily. They sat in comfortable silence as afternoon stretched toward evening, watching their children and feeling the weight of everything they'd built together. The ranch was thriving now, prosperous in ways it had never been under Marcus's solitary management. Their marriage was solid, tested through fires that had forged it into something nearly indestructible. Their children were healthy and growing embodiments of the bridge between worlds that remained controversial, but increasingly accepted. Not perfect ending, because life didn't offer perfect endings, but good endings satisfying one resolution that acknowledged the cost of their choices while affirming that those choices had been worth making. They'd paid price for their love, would continue paying it in smaller ways as long as they lived. But they'd also reaped rewards that went beyond simple happiness, built something that mattered beyond their individual satisfaction. As sunset painted the desert in familiar shades of orange and purple, Marcus found himself thinking about that moment 5 years ago when he'd knelt in the dust and told the biggest lie of his life. He'd claimed Ayana as his intended fabricated relationship that didn't exist, gambled everything on desperate deception. But the lie had revealed truth he hadn't known existed. That he was capable of choosing life over grief, capable of loving again, despite loss, capable of building new future, instead of just mourning past. The lie had shown Ayana that her choices mattered, that she could refuse others' expectations, and forge her own path, that strength and vulnerability could coexist without diminishing each other. Sometimes lies told in desperation carried more truth than facts spoken in certainty. Their marriage was proof of that paradox, demonstration that the most authentic relationships could emerge from the most unlikely origins. They'd started with nothing but reckless choice and desperate hope. They'd built something real through accumulated decisions to keep choosing each other, keep fighting for their partnership, keep believing that love could transcend the divisions others insisted were absolute. That was their story, their truth, their legacy. Not perfect or easy or uncomplicated, but real in ways that mattered, authentic in ways that would endure. They'd taken desperate lie and transformed it through commitment and courage into truth that would outlast them both, carried forward by their children and their example into future that remained uncertain, but no longer felt impossible. Marcus reached for Ayana's hand, fingers interlacing with practiced ease. She squeezed back acknowledgement and promised both. Whatever came next, whatever challenges waited, they'd face it together. That was what marriage meant, what partnership required, what love looked like when stripped of romance and left with fundamental commitment to another person's well-being and shared future. Some men measure courage by the size of their enemy. Marcus had learned to measure it by the size of his commitment, by his willingness to keep choosing difficult love over easy isolation, to keep building despite knowing how easily it could all collapse. That was courage that mattered, not dramatic gestures, but daily decisions to honor vows and support partner and raise children and build life that meant something beyond personal satisfaction. He'd walked into that gathering 5 years ago with nothing to lose because he'd already lost everything that mattered. Now he had everything to lose because he'd built new life worth fighting for. That transformation was complete circle journey, from grief to love, from isolation to family, from desperate lie to fundamental truth. And as stars began to emerge overhead and their children's laughter echoed across their property, and Ayana's hand remained warm in his. Marcus understood that he'd found what he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. Not replacement for what he'd lost, but something new that honored the past while embracing the future. Not easy happiness, but deep satisfaction that came from choosing difficulty that mattered over comfort that meant nothing. Their lie had become their truth, their desperation had become their strength, their improbable love had become their legacy. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything that mattered distilled into the simple reality of two people who'd chosen each other against all odds and built life that proved such choices could survive and even thrive despite everything designed to destroy them. The desert stretched endlessly under emerging stars, indifferent to human drama and struggle. But on one small ranch, two people who'd started as strangers bound by desperate lies had become partners bound by accumulated truth. They'd survived everything thrown at them and emerged not intact but transformed, not unchanged, but strengthened by changes they'd endured. And their children played in the gathering dusk, innocent of the battles fought to give them the life they took for granted, unaware of the courage required to build the family that felt natural to them, but had been revolutionary to create. They were future their parents had chosen to believe in, when believing seemed foolish proof that love could bridge worlds and lies could become truth, when people were willing to do the difficult work of transformation. That was the story, not of perfect romance or easy love, but of two broken people who'd found each other through desperation and built something worth keeping through stubborn refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. They'd lied their way into commitment and chosen their way into love, transforming desperate fabrication into fundamental truth through 5 years of daily decisions to honor what they'd built together. Some lies reveal deeper truth than facts can capture. Some loves forged in crisis prove stronger than loves built in peace. Some families created through impossible choices become more resilient than families formed through conventional means. Marcus and Ayana proved all of those principles through their existence, through their survival, through their stubborn insistence that their marriage mattered regardless of who said it shouldn't. And as night claimed the desert and their children came inside for dinner, and Ayana moved through their home with confident familiarity, and Marcus felt peace settle over him like blessing. He'd stopped believing he deserved. He understood that the lie had been worth it. Everything that came from it, every challenge faced and overcome, every moment of doubt and fear and struggle, of it was worth the simple reality of this moment in this life and this love that had started as desperate fiction and become a mutable fact. The poor rancher had offered a fake marriage to save an Apache warrior from forced union. But somewhere between the lie and the truth, the fake became real. The desperate became determined, and the impossible became simply what was. That transformation was their victory, their legacy, their truth. And it was enough to build a life on, enough to raise children, within enough to prove that love could transcend any boundary if people were brave enough to choose it despite everything that said they shouldn't. Their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning its next chapter, carried forward by children who'd never known a world where their parents' love wasn't real and solid and worth fighting for. That innocence was the gift Marcus and Ayana had given them, the freedom to assume that love across boundaries was possible because they'd never experienced a world where it wasn't. And maybe that was how change really happened, not through dramatic revolutions, but through accumulated small victories that became the foundation for next generation's assumptions about what was possible. The lie had become truth. The fake had become real. The desperate had become determined. And two people who'd started as strangers bound by impossible circumstances had become family bound by love that had been tested through fires and emerged stronger for the forging. That was their legacy, written not in grand gestures, but in daily choices, not in perfect victories, but in stubborn persistence, not in easy love, but in difficult commitment that proved stronger than any obstacle placed in its path. And as Marcus and Ayana gathered their children for dinner and settled into evening routines that had become comfortable through repetition, and the desert night settled around their home with familiar embrace, and stars wheeled overhead, in patterns that had witnessed countless human dramas play out across millennia, the truth of their love needed no further defense or justification. It simply was as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet, as enduring as the mountains that surrounded their valley, as true as any truth that had ever been spoken with full honesty rather than desperate fabrication. They had lied their way into this life, but they had lived their way into this truth, and that was enough.